It was raining outside, and every drop of rain fell very loudly and hit the metal roof of the car. There was a car parked in the middle of the forest. There was no one near it. It was unclear how it appeared in this forest in such weather. If you look from above, through the glass hatch of this roof, you could see someone's body lying on the back seat of the car. When he opened his eyes, he saw the tops of the trees through the sunroof of the car and heard the raindrops falling loudly and hitting the roof of the car. One of those drops leaked through the car's sunroof and landed right on his face. It was difficult for him to open his eyes, so he lay there and only felt how drop after drop fell on his face. He opened his eyes and was very surprised and did not understand where he was. He couldn't concentrate and see everything as it was because everything was blurry before his eyes. After just a few seconds, the picture became much clearer, and he saw what was in the car. The first thing he tried to do was because it was very uncomfortable for him to lie down. He did it with difficulty. When he tried to turn around, he realized that his hands were behind him, and he couldn't do anything with them, and he also felt something wet. His hands were tied behind his back, and from one of his bandaged palms, blood was flowing onto the seat where he was lying. Despite his condition, he first tried to approach and sit on the seat in this car. This guy had a huge bruise under one eye and was trying to remember what happened to him. He lowered his eyes and wanted to see what was around him in this car. He saw on the floor near this seat several tin cans that someone had already drunk. Then he raised his head and saw that the same cans were also lying on the seat, and they were all empty. The first thing that came to his mind was to try to open the car he was in. To do this, he knelt down and began to move towards one of the doors. Then when he approached the door, he lifted one of his legs and stepped on the handle of the door. He needed to do the same thing with his foot so that he could do it with his hand. So he grabbed hold of it and pressed his foot on that handle. In fact, this car had been in the forest for a very long time. It was all rusty and had no wheels. When he opened the door of this car, he heard a bird chirping that was sitting on a branch. He took a few steps forward despite the fact that he had no shoes and scared the birds so that they flapped their wings and flew away. Despite the weather conditions, he understood that he couldn't stay in this car. He moved forward. It was getting dark outside. The rain was still pouring down. The weather was just awful. After a while, he saw something flickering ahead, and it looked like the light of lanterns. He decided that he should go in this direction, and he was not mistaken. He really came out on the road. Right in front of him stood a metal structure on which hung billboards with a description of the route and the direction where it goes. He carefully read everything that was written in order to understand where he needs to go next. Look first in one direction, and on this road he did not see a single car approaching. Then he looked in the other direction, and he also didn't see any cars. He felt strange. And most importantly, he didn't understand where he was and how to get out of there. There was complete silence on the street. He wanted to hear at least some sound and understand that there was someone nearby. He turned his head to the side. In front was a huge mountain. He stood and looked at it. His hands were still behind him. I don't understand why, but he couldn't take his eyes off this mountain. It seemed to attract him. After just a few seconds, a dark burgundy light appeared from behind this mountain, and it seemed to completely absorb this mountain. He watched carefully what was happening before his eyes, and it seemed very strange to him. At that moment, he heard some sounds. These sounds became louder and louder. They were approaching him. Turning his head to the side, he saw that someone on a motorcycle was indeed approaching him. This made him wary. He didn't know how to react. On the one hand, it was someone from the people, but on the other hand, it could be his enemy. The motorcycle was very close to him. He stood there and was afraid to move. The motorcycle driver was also very surprised why this guy was standing right in the middle of the road and not moving aside. So the motorcycle driver had to make a sharp turn and brake near this guy. The motorcycle driver was also surprised who this guy was and why he was standing right in the middle of the road. The motorcycle with the owner drove around this guy and stopped not far from him. By lowering one leg of the motorcycle and placing it so that it stands. The owner of the motorcycle approached this guy and started swearing loudly at him, saying, "Is he really tired of living?" The owner of the motorcycle took off his helmet and said it was her, so that he would not drag strangers into his personal problems. Then the owner of the motorcycle lowered her eyes down to the road and saw drops of blood he did not understand. Come closer to this guy. She realized that blood was dripping from this guy's body, but she still didn't understand where it was coming from. So she asked him if he really needed an ambulance, but she didn't hear anything in response. Then she grabbed the guy by the shoulder again and asked him why he wasn't answering her. She didn't understand what happened to this guy and why he was on this road and silent. The guy turned his head, looked to the side, and tried to say something indistinctly. Then he realized that he couldn't say anything. He took a deep breath and started coughing loudly. There were marks on this guy's neck from when someone tried to strangle him so he couldn't speak. When the owner of the motorcycle saw all this, she realized that something was wrong with this guy, and he definitely needed help. The owner of the motorcycle took off one glove from her hand and said that she would now untie the guy's hands. She asked the guy not to move so as not to cause him any extra pain. The owner of the motorcycle came from behind, pulled the rope, and very carefully began to remove it from the guy's hands. The part of the rope that tied the guy's hands was covered in blood, so she threw it on the ground. The guy, when he felt that his hands were freed, he looked at them. What was his surprise? His one arm was completely damaged and it was bandaged. He felt a sharp pain in that arm. Then he turned to the side with his other hand and held the injured arm so that the pain would subside a little. It was unclear what was wrong with this hand, but it was all cut and bandaged and blood was flowing from it. He thought that he really wanted to wash his hands after all this. They seemed very dirty to him. The owner of the motorcycle looked at this guy and thought that something was wrong here. She said that this guy looked like crap and needed to be examined because he had a huge bruise on his face. There were strangulation marks on his neck and his arm was all mangled. The owner of the motorcycle said she doubted that ignoring all this was a good idea and asked if she could look at the hand. The guy was very scared and afraid to show it, and he was also in a lot of pain. The owner of the motorcycle told him again that she wanted to look at his hand. She would be very careful. She just needed to look. She very gently took the guy's wounded hand and began to examine it from all sides. The girl asked him if it was some kind of animal that had maimed him like that. Despite the fact that the guy didn't remember anything and couldn't speak at all, he answered that no. The girl looked at this guy's hand and she was horrified. She took a very deep breath. She had nothing to say. Her hands were holding the guy's crippled arm and she asked him if he could move his arm. The guy tried to bend his fingers and he succeeded, so he said that he could move his hand a little. The girl said that thanks to the tape, the bleeding was stopped. And that was of course good, but it was wrong to cover the wound with it. She said that it would hurt the guy a lot when he would remove this sticky tape. And she also said that she didn't want to say this, but if he didn't do it himself, then it looks like someone wanted to harm him much more than help him. The guy didn't say anything. He just swallowed his saliva. She continued to talk about how maybe he could tell her what happened to him, and then she could help him. This guy lowered his head, took his hand back, and thought, it seemed like he was remembering something. He looked at his one wounded hand and tried to remember what had happened to him. At some point, fear and horror appeared in his eyes. He didn't even understand why this was happening to him. He remembered seeing something, but it was rather vague and he couldn't describe it in any way. The next moment, he saw much chuchi. It was a cross that was hanging from someone ours, but he did not see the person himself. The last thing he remembered was that he grabbed the man's shirt and pulled it with his hand. Then everything was back as blurry as it had been before. His memories became worse and worse, and it seemed that he could no longer see or remember anything. The next thing he remembered in his memories was his bloody hand without one finger and blood around it. These memories made him feel sick. He lowered his head and covered his face with his healthy hand. Despite what he saw, he told the girl that he absolutely did not remember how it all happened. The girl told him, okay, it's okay. He'll be able to remember in time. You just have to hope. Then the girl asked his name, but the guy silently said nothing in response. He thought again. It seemed that he was remembering his name, that he had forgotten that too. The girl looked at him. There was pity in her eyes, but she should have at least understood something about him and what happened to him. The guy got very upset and started saying that everything that was happening to him was strange. The most important thing is that it seems to him that he can't remember anything, why he is here and why this happened to him. He started crying. At that moment, he felt a sharp pain, and from this pain, his eyes closed. He could not stand it. The pain was so strong that his legs began to weaken and he began to stagger. The girl saw that he was staggering. She told him to be careful and grabbed him so that he wouldn't fall. The guy asked her for forgiveness and said that he had a very bad headache. The girl looked to the side, and you understand that with this guy, everything is really not so simple and he needs help. Then she patted him on the shoulder, telling him that everything would be okay. She looked at him, smiled, and said that he could call her Natalie. And then she added that she would help him if he only wanted it. The first thing the girl said and reached into her pocket was that they would start by calling an ambulance. But when she wanted to get her phone, she realized that her pocket was empty. She didn't have a phone. At that moment, she became very indignant because she did not understand how her phone could disappear. The guy got even more upset because he understood that his condition was really bad. He asked the girl what they should do now. The girl approached the guy and told him not to worry. It was just a trifle. And then she added that she had a motorcycle and therefore there was no reason for him to be upset. Then she added that if they couldn't call an ambulance right here, she could take him to the hospital herself. They got on the motorcycle together and raced towards the hospital. After a while, they were near the eastern gate. When they arrived at the eastern gate, the girl thought that it was very strange because the gates were not usually open so early. Then she looked and didn't see the attendant who was opening the gates. She thought that there was no one anywhere. She hoped that they hadn't changed the schedule. The girl said that there are 2 bridges in that place, and they can check the second bridge. They approached the southern gate very quickly. I hope to pass through here. But on the board they saw a sign that it was closed because the bridges had already been raised. The girl thought that this was very bad. She thought that these bridges shouldn't close early. It was some kind of nonsense. They both looked at the other side. I don't understand how they can get there. The guy asked the girl if they were really on an island, and she answered that they were, especially since they were on a private island. The guy asked her if this is a private island, then why is she here? The girl replied that it was very obvious because she was looking for detours. The girl turned her head and looked at the guy. She told him that she would also like to ask him about the same thing, but he doesn't remember anything. The guy shook his head. Then the girl turned around, closed her eyes, took a deep breath. She needed to think. She understood that they were stuck here and something would have to be done. The girl looked back at the guy and looked at his face. It was very sincere and uncomprehending. She was also very upset about what happened and did not understand how I could continue to unite. She looked at this guy like he is Zaid because of the pain he feels in his hand. His mutton arm was in a lot of pain, and if he didn't get the help he needed, it could get even worse. This guy's legs were also constantly using the motorcycle's footrests due to the pain he was experiencing. The girl died and exhaled again, thinking about what she could do for this guy. Then she said that she had a new plan. She knows one of the guys who, strangely enough, lives very close by and showed him. Then this girl said that this guy is very nice and they can borrow his phone and warm up while they wait for the bridges to open. The guy had no choice but to agree that he was ready to go with her. The girl started the motorcycle and it hummed, and she told the guy to hold on to her. They started to leave this place very quickly and didn't even notice that the raised bridge crushed one person to death. There was a lot of human blood there. It was just crushed between the iron. They drove along an empty road with lanterns on the sides illuminating the road. There was not a single soul in their path. They were driving fast enough that it seemed she knew the area well. The guy held on to her very tightly. He was afraid of hurting himself again. She added gas in order to get to the desired place as quickly as possible. It seemed like she drove along this road every day and knew it perfectly. At some point she stopped and I put my foot on the asphalt. It was written ahead that you would have to go on foot further on the walking trail. The guy asked her how far her friend's house was from this place. The girl said that it was not far at all. And then she looked at him and asked him if he thought he could walk a little. He replied that of course. The girl said that it was very wonderful because they would have to go up and pointed her finger upwards. She showed that they would have to climb the path that was in front of them. It was dark and led somewhere deep up. The girl extended her hand to him so that he could take it and she could help him in any case. She said that if he was afraid, he could hold her hand while they went up. The guy smiled, took her hand in his and thanked her. It was very sweet of her. The girl said that she is simply doing what any person in her place would do, and nothing more. She held his healthy hand and said that they needed to go as quickly as possible before it got completely dark. They climbed up the road, the streetlights on one side and the moon that was in the sky illuminated it. The girl walked ahead and the guy behind her followed behind her and tried to keep up. Having climbed up a little, he saw on one side that the same birds that were sitting on the branch when he got out of that same car were sitting. Take another step forward. He felt that he was starting to choke. He had difficulty breathing. He walked and breathed very heavily. Every step he took was difficult for him. The hand that held the girl's hand became completely weak. It was hard for him to hold on to her. He suddenly lost control of himself, and his hand slipped away from the girl's hands. At that moment, the girl turned around and looked at the guy. She didn't expect that something else could happen to him. She saw that he was feeling bad and asked him if he really needed a break so he could go on. The guy replied that he did. The guy said he needed to catch his breath a little bit before he could continue walking. The girl asked him how he was feeling, and he tried to answer her incoherently. Then he said that he had a severe headache and felt that his vision was getting worse, and he could not see anything clearly again. The guy said he felt dizzy and couldn't do anything about it. He came with his hand on his eye trying to concentrate so that his vision became clear. Well, despite this, his condition was getting worse. His pupils began to roll upwards. He couldn't do anything about it. His legs became weak, and they could not support his body at all. He began to sway and then fall. The girl managed to react in time. She caught him at the moment when he was already practically unconscious. She knelt down with him because it was hard for her to keep him unconscious. She screamed that it was dangerous and asked the guy if he was okay and how he felt. But despite this, she did not receive any answer. She tried to somehow bring him to his senses, but it was completely useless. He lay in her arms with his eyes closed and did not make a single sound. The girl hit him on one cheek, then on the other. She wanted him to wake up. She didn't stop slapping him on the cheeks, but the guy continued to lie motionless or his eyes were closed. When she realized that this guy had passed out, she went into shock and didn't know what to do. Having pulled herself together a little, the girl said that in that case, she would act differently. She took the guy by the arms and tried to pull him. She thought if she could get him back on his feet, then they could very slowly but move on. She thought that she just needed to take one step, but he did not regain consciousness, and it was impossible to do. So she continued to drag it out herself one step after another, and sooner or later she thought they would get to the place where her friend lived. She took a few more steps up this staircase and felt that her legs were also very tired. So she decided to take it aside and take a rest herself. Having put the guy on the ground, she exhaled and sat down herself to catch her breath. Then the girl wiped under her lap. It was hard enough for her to bring this guy in. And she looked at him who was lying on her lap with his eyes closed and who did not make a single sound. She was scared, so she decided to pinch him to understand if this guy was really unconscious. Despite the fact that she pinched him, he did not open his eyes and continued to lie like that. At that moment, she got scared. She tried to move away from him a little further. She didn't understand whether he was alive or not. She was scared. She didn't know what to do and even bit her lower lip. With one hand, she reached into the pocket of her jacket. What was her surprise at that moment? She saw that the phone was lying there and it hadn't disappeared anywhere. She picked up her phone, found Liam's contact, and dialed. I pressed the call button. She wanted someone to come to her aid as quickly as possible. The girl put the phone to her ear, waiting for someone to answer her call. She heard someone pick up the phone and say yes. The girl asked Liam this. She was very scared. So she told her friend that she needed his help and he needed it urgently. The guy was sitting near the fireplace and he asked what she had already done. The girl asked him without any questions. He was just supposed to meet her at the pedestrian ramp. The guy threw some wood into the fireplace. He wanted to find out from her what happened. The girl told him not to call her back. She then immediately turned off her phone despite her friend wanting some explanation. The next thing she did was turn off the sound on her phone so that the calls could not be heard. Putting the phone in her pocket, she once again touched the guy who was lying on her lap. At that moment, she thought that she was very lucky no matter what. Then she decided to turn it on its side because she felt uncomfortable. I slapped him on the back a few times and she thought about everything that had happened. The only thing she understood was that she would have to wait a little in this place until help came. She held this guy on her lap and stroked his back. Two birds were sitting on a branch of one tree and watching everything that was happening. At some point, she felt something on his back and it really surprised her. When she ironed through the t-shirt he was wearing, red spots began to appear. It was clearly blood, but it was unclear what it was from. These spots became bigger and bigger. It seemed like they were bleeding really badly. She lifted his shirt. The birds that were sitting on the branch at that moment flapped their wings and flew away. The girls were even more surprised. Her eyes widened at that moment when she saw what was on this guy's body. She was in shock. When she lifted the t-shirt, she saw that there was some kind of inscription on its back, and it was made with a knife. On his back, it was written with a knife that he was a murderer. She was in shock. A small baby duck that almost all small children had was floating in the bathtub. It was rubber and always floated, so they threw it in when he went swimming. At some point, this rubber fishing rod seemed very big to him, and he was even afraid of it. He was sitting in the bathroom, and his mother, who was standing next to him, was asking him if he liked the rubber duck. He huddled in the corner of the bathroom, tucked his legs in and rested his palms on his knees. She knelt by his bathtub and watched him take a bath. She took a shower and started pouring water on him from the shower. He said that he didn't like this duck. She said that she thought the rod was pretty cute and there was no way she wouldn't like it. The little boy sitting in the bathtub lifted one eye and looked at her. She said that this duck looks just like him. He's also very cute. Her car pulled up to the house. She went inside and asked where her friend was. Was he hiding again? The boy was sitting on the carpet and looking at one of the books when he heard that someone had entered the house and was approaching him. In his hand was a very small photograph that was turned upside down. He kept trying to look at it. He liked looking at this photo. When he heard that they were looking for him, he turned his head and heard a knock on the door. So he got up very quickly and decided that he needed to hide as quickly as possible. A voice from behind the door asked he was there. The boy ran very quickly and slipped and fell into one of the corners. The door opened and she called him. She knew for sure that he was hiding somewhere in this room. She looked around and realized that he was somewhere here. Then she lowered her head and saw that on the rug below was his album that he liked to look at. She noticed that one photo from this album was missing. She opened one door, decided to go inside, and started looking for him. The only place he could hide was the corner behind the washing machine. When she came closer, she saw that he was sitting exactly like that and had covered his eyes with his hand so as not to see anything around him. When she came closer, the boy lowered his hand and looked out from behind her. He sat in the corner and looked so pathetic she came closer to him. Then she asked if he really didn't want to talk to her at all. The boy turned his eyes away. Then she asked if he didn't even want to look at her because she was so kind to him. She didn't understand why he was doing this. The boy started to use something from behind. Then she asked what was behind his back and what he was hiding from her. He took the photograph from one hand to the other to show it to her. Then he handed the photo to her for her to see. He very hesitantly, holding this photograph with one hand, began to ask her if he could. He asked in a pleading voice if he could please. It seemed very important to him. The boy asked if he could please play with this boy, the same one who was in this photo. In this photo, there was a boy his age who was playing on the console. When she saw the picture of this boy, his huge eyes and his face, at that moment she became very angry. Her face became displeased. She was very angry. The very next moment, she snatched this photograph from the hands of this little boy. And with all the strength she had, she began to squeeze it in her hand. The next moment, she grabbed the child's hand and pulled him up. He was very scared. After which, she lifted him up, lowered him down, and sat down on her knees opposite him. She started talking about how he should understand why he is here, because that is not why he is here. And he knows this very well, so he has no right to ask for such things. Then she cut his head towards her and said that he should stop any hysterics that he had. She calmed this boy down. There was resentment in his eyes. He wanted something completely different. She kept stroking his head and telling him that he had stopped, that he didn't dare ask for anything. Tears started to flow from his eyes. He didn't want it to be like this. She stroked his head and told him to be a good boy. Despite the fact that she was calming him down, there were more and more tears in his eyes, and it seemed like he was already having a tantrum. At that moment, he started to shake. He was so offended that he could not calm down. She took the same duck that she had launched in the bathroom, placed it on her two palms, and brought it to him. He felt even more offended. He continued to cry, and the picture in his eyes became blurry. At that moment, she took his hand and raised his hand up and down to calm him down. Then she took this duck and put it in his hand. The boy did not stop. He also continued to cry. His tears fell on this duckling. He was very upset that he couldn't play with anyone. Then she hugged him very tightly and began to whisper in his ear to calm him down. But he continued to cry. She stroked his head, pitied him, called him her child. She pitied him and said, "We are a little boy." But the next moment he pushed her back and shouted at her that no. He shouted at her to get out and tried to hit her with his little fists. She grabbed his hands. The boy was hysterical. She held him tightly, and at that moment he screamed for her not to touch him. He continued to cry in her arms, and she kept stroking his head. He couldn't calm down. Tears flowed from his eyes in streams. No words had any effect on him. When Natalie's friend arrived and saw this guy lying unconscious on the ground, he asked him if she had just found him on the side of the road. The girl replied that in general, yes, and asked her friend to lift the guy up. When they lifted him up a little, he still remained unconscious. She grabbed this guy by the legs, and that's how they decided they could carry him. The very next moment, this guy trembled, his face changed, and he began to make an incomprehensible sound. This guy woke up, kicked the girl away, and screamed to be let go. The girl was very surprised. The guy who had just been unconsciously lying on the ground showed such aggression he shouted for them to go away. She didn't understand what happened and why he was staring at her. But the next moment, he again had his eyes closed and also unconsciously could not stand on his own 2 feet. The girl said that he was just sleeping. Her friend who came to her aid told her to hold him tighter. The girl said that she was just scared. That's why it happened. They decided they needed to try again, and she bent down again to grab his legs. But this time he didn't twitch or fight. There were tears in his eyes. It was very dark outside and raining when they approached the house with the tower. The wind was rustling inside this house. The light was on, but it was somehow very unusual. Lilac at the bottom and green at the top. The rain was continuously dripping on the windows of this house, and you could hear every drop. When they went inside, the girl thanked her friend Liam for helping on the ceiling of this house. There were frescoes painted, and on one of these frescoes, there was a girl angel. Natalie looked at this fresco, and at her friend she asked that she drag him into this. She wiped away the rain that had wet her hair and said that, frankly, she would have to ask him for one more favor. The girl told her friend that she told this guy that she lost her phone so he should play along with her. She said this because phones are tapped and they risk being discovered. And then she lowered her head and said, and then she looked at this guy who was lying on the floor. The girl said that when this guy wakes up, her friend should call her Natalie in front of him. Her friend adjusted his glasses and started to grumble because he didn't understand why she needed all this and a fake name. The girl said that it would be better for them and for this guy if he didn't find out who they really were. And then she added that in this case, she would call the guy Christopher. Her friend adjusted his glasses and agreed with what she was saying. Then he took off his glasses again and looked to see if they needed to be cleaned. He said that if she was interested, of course, then this guy was out of place here. And why did he add that he doesn't even want to imagine what this guy went through, judging by his appearance? The girl looked at her friend and said that now he certainly understands why she simply couldn't leave him in such a state on the road. Her friend continued to wipe his glasses from the drops that had fallen on him in the rain. He said that tomorrow when they leave, she should be kind enough to put on a helmet. Her friend said that she shouldn't be called carefully, especially after she did something so stupid. They stood on different sides opposite each other, and in the middle lay a guy who continued to sleep. The girl told her friend that she knew everything perfectly well and asked him for forgiveness. Her friend said that they need to hurry until this guy wakes up. The girl agreed with him. Then this guy took out the first aid kit and opened the top lid. The first aid kit contained scissors, bandages, and other medications. He took the scissors and looked at how sharp they were. He needed to understand if he could do it. The guy told the girl to be very careful and to hold him tightly. The girl was a little confused. She could have assumed that she would have to do it, but her friend said that it was her idea. So the girl came closer to the lying guy. She thought about how it would be better to hold him. She took him by the shoulder and sat on him from behind so that he couldn't hit her if it hurt. Then she turned him over onto his back so that he was lying flat and looking straight at her. She used one knee to make him so that he couldn't do anything to her even if he woke up. And she took his other hand with both hands and pressed it to the floor very tightly. Its sting was that same wounded hand. The guy told the girl that he couldn't believe he was going to do this, so he put a napkin under his injured hand. Then he took this hand with his hands. He held scissors in his other hand. He had to remove this sticky tape from his hand. Then he slowly began to lift this sticky tape and ribbon with scissors in order to cut it in one place. Despite the fact that the guy's hands were held very tightly, he did not react to this at all. His eyes were closed. Then he used scissors to thread the sticky tape through and cut it so that he could remove it later. He very carefully began to cut this sticky tape with scissors so as not to damage this guy's hand. The girl tried her best to hold the guy despite the fact that he was unconscious. She was afraid that he would start. At some point his head started to give way. It was clear that he was waking up. He needed to be held even tighter. The guy lying on the floor blinked, which meant he woke up and now he could hit again like last time. When the guy woke up, the first thing he saw was a saint painted on the ceiling of this temple. He tried to turn around, but it was hard for him. He understood what was holding him back. He saw in front of him the very girl with whom he was trying to get out of this island. She was sitting on him, so he said that she was very heavy. The next thing he felt was that he couldn't move his uninjured arm because her knee was holding his arm down. He turned his head to the other side and saw that the container that he had was damaged by a girl, and she was holding it with both of her hands, and he tried to break free. But he didn't succeed. She held this guy very tightly. Then he asked her what she was doing. This girl's friend told her to hold the guy as tight as possible because he already cut the tape and now he needs to remove the tape from his hand. The guy turned his head and saw a stranger in front of him. He asked him who he was, the girl's friend. He realized that he couldn't do it quickly because the tape was stuck to his wound. The next thing he said was that it was going to hurt a lot and he needed to be held tight. The guy started screaming in pain. He didn't understand what this stranger was actually doing. He was just getting rid of the sticky tape. The girl squeezed her injured hand with all her might, although the guy asked them to let him go. Tears appeared in his eyes at that moment. He couldn't bear the pain and he didn't understand what they were doing to him. The young man very carefully began to remove this sticky tape from his hand, but the pain was so great that the guy screamed for them to stop doing this. His eyes were completely filled with tears. He could only scream for them to stop. But the girl and her friend did not hear, and it seemed that they did not listen to this guy. They tried to give him first aid when the sticky tape did not come off. Then his whole hand was covered in blood. He screamed so loudly that it seemed like everyone in heaven had already heard him. The girl's friend told the guy not to move because he needed to treat the wound and took the tourniquet that was in his first aid kit. The guy screamed no. He was constantly screaming and crying, but despite this, no one was going to let him go. He screamed that it was very painful for him and asked everyone to stop. Well, despite this, the girl's friend pulled a tourniquet on his arm so that the bleeding stopped. He said that he was just an idiot and that he shouldn't scream so loudly because they couldn't stop anymore. He pulled it really hard so that the blood where one of his fingers was cut off stopped flowing. The girl's friend felt a kick in his direction, so he immediately said that the guy had better stop resisting, otherwise it would be worse. Then he told me not to move because he was going to disinfect the wound now. The guy couldn't hold back. He started pushing the girl away from him with one hand, the one that was whole. Then he started swearing loudly and asking her to let him go right now. But in spite of all his cries and all his squeals, she grabbed his hand and held it very tightly in her hand. Then she fell on him with her whole body so as to press him down so that he could not move. She held the guy's body with all her strength so that he wouldn't break free and interfere with them. Her friend at that moment poured out a solution to disinfect the wound and held the guy's hand. The guy no longer screamed so loudly, he just whined. He no longer had so much strength. He looked up at the frescoes that were on the ceiling, but he could no longer see them clearly as he had a few seconds ago. After he was disinfected early where one of his fingers was cut off, his entire hand started to cramp. The guy turned his head away. He continued to whine. The girl asked her friend, he finished, to which her friend replied that not at all. And at that moment, he took a lighter and a needle. When he lit the lighter, he held the needle to the fire in an attempt to disinfect it. He said that the wound still needed stitching. His hands were shaking a little. When the guy heard that they were going to stitch up the wounds, he started to develop all over and shout that no, no, and no, he says no. The girl grabbed this guy by the face, hit him, and told him to get it together. She held his head in her hands. The girl told him to look at her and listen to her carefully so that he wouldn't take his eyes off her. She ordered him to inhale and exhale on her command. It was quite simple. There were tears in his eyes. Earlier, where the finger was cut off, the girl's friend brought a needle and he needed to stitch up the wound. The girl told the guy to take a breath. Everyone waited for him to calm down. Then she told him to exhale. He sensitively repeated after her everything she said. She told him that he was great. Then she told him again to inhale, and then she told him to exhale. He did everything as she said. She watched him as he exhaled after she spoke, and she understood that this was how she calmed him down. Then she said inhale, and at that moment the needle touched the skin on his finger. Then she said inhale again, and the needle pulled the skin upwards. You only had to hook it on this side to make a snowball. Then when the guy inhaled, the needle pierced the skin around his finger. And when he exhaled, the thread was already threaded. Now everything had to be done from the other side. Then the guy inhaled and everything blurred before his eyes again, and everything seemed dark red. He only heard what was being said to him and saw nothing at all. After a while, the picture in his eyes began to clear up, and he saw that same angel painted on the ceiling. He was already on his own, and there was no need to tell him when to inhale and when to exhale. They didn't finish stitching up his wound and bandaging it. His arm was completely free. The girl looked at the guy and said that he certainly did a good job. Then she said that the guy who treated his wound was her friend, the same one she had already told him about. This guy said his name was Christopher, and then he added that he heard that he didn't remember his name, which is sad, of course. Christopher said he had some painkillers for him and took out one tablet. He said that it was ibuprofen. It might not be a strong enough medicine, but it was still something. They didn't have anything else. The girl looked at the guy who was swallowing a painkiller pill and said that first he needed to be washed off. She asked him to stand up and helped him do it. Then the girl took this guy and took him to the bathroom. Her friend said that she looked under her feet when she was going down. The girl's friend remained sitting in the middle of the temple in which they were and in which he lived. He collected the bloody napkin from Paul and any other items that could indicate what was happening here. He held this bloody napkin in his hands and tried to understand what had just happened to him. He raised his eyes and began to rub the transfer he needed to understand only why. And why did she bring a stranger here? She always put the interests of others above her own. He didn't understand how she could behave like that. She treated everyone else exactly the same. That's why I decided that he also needed to calm down a bit and think about what happened. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He knew he needed to calm down and make some kind of decision. He doesn't automatically understand why he took his phone out of his pocket. And then he turned it on and needed to understand what kind of boy it was who was all covered in bruises and wounds. He couldn't be completely calm about the house either because he had already experienced this before. He looked at the avatar that was on his phone and thought that this guy could get him into trouble. But if this is really the case, then this shouldn't happen to them and they have enough problems of their own. He looked at this boy who was next to him and thought that he absolutely didn't care what else he could get into. Unexpectedly for himself, he dropped his phone and this phone fell right on the ball. When he fell, he hit his edge and a huge crack appeared across the entire screen. He stood for a while and looked at the phone that was lying on the floor, but he understood that he needed to get rid of it. The next thing he did was step on the phone with his huge rubber boot to crush it. At that moment, he thought of only one thing, that he had to get rid of him, and he had to do it as soon as possible. He looked at this phone and thought that before whoever did this to this guy finds them, he should get rid of the phone so that they are not tapped. At the end of this staircase, there was a door through which they entered and closed themselves. His hand was bandaged, and it wasn't bleeding as much as it had when she found him. The girl said that she should put a bag on this hand so that it doesn't get the bandage wet. When she said that she was really sorry for making him go through all this against his will, the guy sat silently and looked at her straight in the eyes. He didn't look at everything that happened. He trusted her. The girl said that he lost consciousness, and she was very scared that it was because of her that he felt even worse, and then he would start himself. She added that there was no need to decide how to act in such a situation, but she made a decision. The guy didn't say anything to her. He turned in the other direction and listened to what she was telling him. Then the girl asked about the fact that they found several wounds on his back, and they should be disinfected too. The guy asked her again if he had it on his back too early. The girl said that yes, he got hurt when he lost consciousness in the forest. The girl told him to take a shower, and then she would prepare everything necessary to disinfect the wound. She opened the bottle of solution and stood with her back to him. The girl said that she would not spy on him while he was taking a shower. At that moment, the guy said that he could take a shower himself and that nothing would happen to him. The girl asked him if he really thought it was serious that she could leave him here alone. What if he lost consciousness again? She told him to sit on the stool that she put in the shower so that he wouldn't trip and hit his head. Otherwise, he'd have to be treated again. The guy didn't take it and took off his sweatshirt and other things on his own. He threw them and attacked them near the shower stall. Then he went into the shower, and with the one hand that he had left, he opened the tap to let the water flow. Water started dripping from the shower onto the tiles on the floor. He was sitting on a stool that she had placed with his back to her, and on his back was the inscription "Killer," which was made with a knife she was trying to disinfect it. This inscription on June was made very recently because blood was flowing from it. The girl took 2 tampons in both hands to disinfect these wounds on his back. She was scared because she understood that he would be in pain now, and she also didn't understand what the person who made this inscription meant. The guy turned around and saw the girl's expression. He asked her if everything was really that bad. She didn't tell him anything. She then took one of the swabs and tried to disinfect the first letter that was carved with a knife on his back. At that moment, the guy took a deep breath and started breathing on his own in order to calm down. Then he turned his head and asked the girl if these wounds were so deep that it hurt him so much. The girl told him that no, they are not deep at all and he should relax. She took his head, turned it forward, and told him to look in that direction and breathe correctly as she taught him. She took the swab and began to process the second letter of this word. She had already read this word several times. After the second letter, she began to process the third letter. She wanted to know who this guy really was. So she asked him if he really didn't remember anything at all. Maybe he still had some memories. At that moment, he waved his head, making it clear that he didn't remember anything at all. But after some time, he said that he remembers slightly different memories that were in his childhood. He remembers when he was little and cried next to her, but for some reason he doesn't remember her face. He said that he remembers his mother, but these memories are very vague and he does not clearly remember anything. The girl asked him again if he really didn't remember anything at all before the incident when all this happened to him. He looked at her and said that probably not. She disinfected his wound, sat down next to him and thought, so he only remembers his mother. She threw down the bloody tampon and said that she thought that all of them, when in danger, only thought about their mother. But in that case, she meant that it was not at all surprising that he remembered her. The girl smiled, her face became completely different. She said that Mom, most likely they are all cool. The guy who was sitting in the shower didn't understand these words about his mother at all. He didn't know how to relate to them. So turning away from the girl, he said that he didn't know at all what his mother was like. Then he said that he was probably afraid of his mom, and that's why he couldn't say that she was cool. The girl asked him again if he could really be afraid of his own mother. The guy replied that he did. He said that he had very strange feelings. With one hand, he touched his shoulder. His thoughts about his mother scare him much more than the situation when they stitched up his arm. Then the guy asked Natalie for forgiveness. He said that his head was spinning again. After hearing this, the girl sat down next to him. The guy said that it seemed like he got a little carried away. The girl said that in any case she is not here and they can be calm. The guy said that he agrees with this and that is for sure. But there was some sadness in his eyes. He was clearly thinking about something. Then his hands started shaking and he started to tremble all over. The girl asked him if she could ask him one question that he doesn't have to answer. She asked him if it was his mother who did this to him in his hand. The guy lowered his head. He didn't know the answer to this question. He didn't remember anything. The only thing is that when he repeated the word mom, his body began to tremble and fear appeared in his eyes. He said that he gets anxious when he starts thinking about her, that he becomes so anxious to the point of nausea and he begins to hold his other hand with one hand. Then he opened the palm of his injured hand and said that it was hard not to notice how it was shaking. The guy turned his head to the side and said that the wounds on him were nothing more than bite marks. He looked down at the one that was draining from the shower. He said that he didn't want to think about it. Unexpectedly for him, he saw nothing in front of him, which began to frighten him very much. It seemed to him that on the floor in the shower where he was, there was the same duckling that his mother had given him. He was lying on the floor and drops from the shower were falling on him. It was the same duckling that he had. At that moment, he just couldn't hold back. His eyes widened, his pupils too. He was on the edge. The guy closed his eyes so as not to see all this and then shook his head. He bit his lower lip and swallowed the saliva that was in his mouth. Only after that did he open his eyes and look down again. In fact, there was no rubber ducky down in that shower stall. It was all his imagination. He continued to sit, and drops of the shower dripped on him. He then said, "Is this possible?" He turned his head towards the girl and continued to say that his mother was really capable of doing something like that. Then he turned his head away and added that it was simply disgusting if it really was. The girl looked at the guy and told him maybe she does too because he really doesn't remember anything. She told him that she understood perfectly well that the extra memories of her made him anxious, but maybe he would try to remember if she had done this to him. The guy sat and thought, but he didn't know the answer to this question. His head was empty. He tried to close his eyes and strain his head. He wanted to remember what really happened to him. He even put it near his ear in order to remember something, but he couldn't do anything. He took a deep breath and told the girl that he didn't really understand what had happened to him. The guy said that if he can't remember what happened, he would rather think that it wasn't her doing. He looked away and said that this thought was more repulsive to me than all the others that came into his head. The girl said that this was of course understandable and asked for forgiveness for pressuring him with this. They sat in silence in that bathroom for some time. After a long silence, the girl asked the guy if she knew how old he was. At that moment, he thought again. It seemed that he would say that he didn't remember this either. But unexpectedly for everyone, he said that he remembers. He knows that he is 19 years old. And then he added that he doesn't know why he remembers this, but he knows one thing, that it was very important for him. Most likely it was because he had just turned 19, and that is why he remembers how old he is. The girl looked at the guy and said that she should never give him so many years in her life. He of course may not believe it, but he looks like a child. He looked at her and asked, "What do you mean?" The girl looked at him and doubted his words even more. She became even more suspicious. She turned her head sharply to the side, told him to forget, and began to say that if he knows how old he is, then that is definitely progress. The guy was sitting on a chair with the inscription "Killer" on his back, and he wanted to know how old she was. The girl replied that she was 21. When he heard this, he was even more surprised. It seemed to him that she was much older than him. But when he heard how old she was, he told her that she was not much older than him and asked for forgiveness. The girl turned and looked at the guy. She didn't understand why she had to forgive him. So she asked him what he was asking her forgiveness for. The guy turned away. At that moment, he became very upset and started crying again. He started saying that he was asking her forgiveness for the fact that she had to take care of him. And he also asked her for forgiveness, and he started saying that she shouldn't have, and she should have been. He said all this abruptly and incomprehensibly. At that moment, the girl stood up, took a deep breath, and said, "Oh my God." She told the guy, and she doesn't understand what got into his head to ask for forgiveness for all this. She told him that there was basically nothing to apologize for and that her heart was still not in the right place. And because she held him while Chris was stitching up his arm, so he should not complicate the situation. She pulled the shower curtain and said that he should wash now. He should rest. The girl stood behind the shower curtain and looked the other way, but she began to have doubts. She understood that something was wrong with this guy. She began to remember the whole beginning of how she met him. She was very surprised that he had never asked her about the lost phone and still hadn't asked her friend to give him his. And it was also very strange that he went with her to a stranger in an unknown place. She thought that who, if not a child, could be so trusting just like him, but he says that he is 19 years old. This is very suspicious. And the strangest thing is his back. She didn't understand how this could be explained. This inscription is a killer. She thought it would be safer not to touch on the subject now. She decided that this guy could panic in this situation, after which it would be possible to pose a threat. The safest thing would be to take advantage of his amnesia. The girl thought that it would be better for her not to invite her suspicions and her friend. She stood and looked at the bloody tampons that were lying in the wash basin and understood that the guy at that moment could do something terrible. She decided that she just needed to get the guy to the hospital, and then she and Liam could move on. The guy continued to sit on the chair in the shower stall. The very next moment he asked the girl what day it was. She answered that it was August 17th. Unexpectedly for himself, he began to repeat August 17th. He said this and looked at his reflection. He repeated August 17th several more times while looking at the shower drops and his reflection. Unexpectedly for himself, he began to speak on August 16th. He began to move in the opposite direction. After that, he said on August 15th, it was very surprising why he speaks in reverse order. The girl started listening, and she heard this guy say no, it was August 14th. And then he added that most likely it was on August 13th. The girl asked him again if everything was okay. The guy said that yes, he was fine. It was the 13th. He told her through the curtain that his birthday was on August 13th. The girl said that it was very good and that his memory was most likely returning. He was so happy and tried to remember his name. He wanted to say it very quickly. Then he turned his eyes again, strained his thoughts, and it seemed to him that he was about to remember his name. But I understood that he didn't remember his name and couldn't do it in any way. The girl asked the guy if he was okay and why he had gone quiet. The guy continued to sit on the chair and replied that he was fine. He told her that he simply doesn't remember any of his birthday celebrations. The girl said that everything has its time, and he will remember soon, and he should not call. He needs to have time to wash before the hot water is turned off. Well, it seemed like he didn't hear anything. He was trying to remember something else. He automatically said that he would wash himself very quickly and would have time before the hot water was turned off. At that moment, he realized that he remembered his childhood, how he walked to his bed after a shower. He walked up to his bed, turned off the light that was next to his bed and was left alone in complete darkness. Despite the fact that he was small, there was no one else in the room except him, so he was very scared. He looked back and looked around. He needed to make sure that there was no one else in this room. Only after this did he lie down in his bed and cover himself with a blanket. He lay on the pillow with one eye. He looked at what he saw every day before going to bed. Right in front of his bed was a window that was boarded up with plywood and wood. He really started to remember a little. He understood how his childhood went. So he thought that he had most likely been kept locked up for a very long time. The girl was shaping his wounds on his back so that this inscription was not visible. The guy thought that as far as he remembered, these memories were when he was no more than 5 years old. He, like a little child, took his thumb and began to suck it like a pacifier. He thought that maybe he was being held all this time. Then he abruptly took his finger out of his mouth and wondered if he had really been locked in this room all this time. And could he really have been there for so long? That's why he most likely doesn't remember anything. But on the other hand, fortunately, his memories are coming back. But he wasn't sure if he really wanted that because his memories were very cruel. The guy thought that thank God the pain in his whole body had gone away. It must have been all because of the adrenaline that had surged in him. He understood that this was most likely our time, that soon this pain would fall upon him with renewed force. And he also caught himself thinking that he just wanted to sleep because there was absolutely no strength in his body. More than anything, he wanted to pretend that nothing like this had happened and that he didn't feel this pain. The girl took him by the shoulder and said that they were already finished, so he should change his clothes and go to bed. She said that she would now find him something purely clothing so that he could wear it. The hot water in the tap ran out. He managed to take a bath. On the table lay a broken phone, a glass of water, and the charger for this phone was turned on. It is unclear why this phone was broken and why it was lying on the table. He looked at everything that was lying on this table, but he didn't ask anyone anything. As expected, Christopher said that he broke the phone while trying to fix his car. At that moment, the guy asked the laptop. Christopher asked him again what he wanted. The guy answered him that he was saying maybe they have a computer or laptop. It was very unexpected for Christopher, so he didn't know what to tell him. He tightly clutched the side of the chair he was sitting in with his hand so as not to show his emotions. Then he lowered his head and said that he had not had a computer or laptop for quite a long time. He didn't know what to talk about with this guy, and when he heard the sounds, he was glad that it was her. The door to the room actually creaked and his girlfriend walked in. She told them to forgive because she didn't know Chris's phone was broken. While she was walking, she found a blanket in the closet that a guy might sleep on. She gave him this blanket and said that it would make him sleep much warmer at night. Then she slapped the pillow with her hand several times and told him to go to bed. The girl said that she still has a motorcycle, and every morning at 7 o'clock, 8 sirens are heard by the time the bridges should already be raised. She said that he believed that from this place the siren could be clearly heard, and as soon as they were ready to leave, they would go straight to the hospital. She asked the guy again, did he agree with this? He answered her that it sounded like he had no other choice. He glanced towards her friend. It was clear that he didn't quite trust him. The girl looked towards her friend and did not understand why they were behaving like that. She said that her friend may look really creepy, but deep down he is a good guy. In fact, he was a janitor at a church before it was closed. And now the owner pays him for living in this church and looking after his house. The guy looked at this young man and thought about something, but didn't say what. The girl came up to him, patted him on the shoulder and said that he needed to take a break. In fact, she knew that he was worried, but he was safe in this place. She also said that if they can't get out of here by morning, then why don't they rest? She said that Nobu had written to him that he needed to do this. The girl said that she and her friend will sleep outside, so the whole room they are in will be at his disposal. The guy thanked her and nodded his head. He sat with his knees pulled up to his body like a small, frightened child. At the moment when I left this room, I turned off the light in it. The girl turned around again, looked at the guy, and wished him good night. After which, she and her friend left the room and closed the door behind them. The guy covered himself with a blanket and began to think that he really wanted to sleep. But for some reason, he caught himself thinking that it seemed like he shouldn't sleep at all. He thought that he didn't know if he could trust these people. But when he lay down on the pillow, he only thought about how tired he was. Then he began to convince himself that these two seemed to be the only ones who really helped him. He was already falling asleep and thought that it was just so unexpected that all this happened. The only thing he couldn't forgive them for was that they could have warned him that they were going to rip the tape off his hand. And when he was almost asleep, what caught his attention and he looked in that direction. He sat up for an hour. The pillows didn't understand what was happening. He was getting scared. He, like a little child, tried to hide in a corner. It seemed to him that no one would see him that way. He acted the same way as always in his childhood. He simply hid from everything that was happening. At that moment, the guy got scared because he saw another painting that stood near the wall. This painting resembled the same fresco that he had already seen before, but only the angel had a child in his arms. The guy began to carefully examine the face of this saint. It was with closed eyes. The first thing he did was decide to get out of the bed he was lying on. Then he took the same blanket that he had brought to the girls. The next thing he did was go up to the painting and start covering it with the same blanket he took. When he raised his two hands and began to straighten it, it was torn so that he could not see this picture. Something happened in his head and something went wrong. He saw his own two hands, but in front of him he saw an image of his mother and it was very blurry. At that moment he became very scared. He shuddered, and the thought that his mother was somewhere nearby made him burp back. When he jumped back, he didn't even notice that his foot hit the table that stood next to his bed. On this table there was a glass of water which almost turned over, and a very loud noise was heard in the room. At that moment he heard someone approach the door. The guy turned his head. A voice from behind the door asked him if everything was okay. On the other side of the door stood a girl who heard the noise in the room and decided to ask him what happened. The guy, without thinking twice, answered her that everything was fine with him. Then after a pause, he began to explain that when he stood up, he simply hit the chair, and that was the reason for the noise. He added that his head was still a little dizzy at that moment. He stood and looked at the very picture that he had just closed. The girl, without thinking twice, told him maybe he should just lie down and not get up until the morning. The guy sat down on the bed and had no choice but to agree with her. The guy couldn't just lie down and fall asleep. He sat on the bed and looked at the picture he had just closed. What just happened to him? But he clearly understood that it was somehow connected with this picture. He understood that it was she who had caused him to stumble and hit the table. At least that's what he wanted to think. He couldn't sleep. He sat and looked at the closed picture. He thought about what had happened to him. And the most important thing was that he was thinking only about one thing. What had she done that he was so afraid of her? At that moment, he again took his finger into his mouth and began to suck it like a child. The next morning, when dawn just broke, everyone expected that they would be able to get out of this private island. The girl was standing on the street and smoking a cigarette. She was clearly nervous. She looked at the time on her phone several times, not understanding what was going on, because something was clearly wrong. She asked her friend who was sitting next to her why there was no siren, because it should have been on by now. Her friend replied that only half an hour had passed and that delays had happened before. She didn't like this explanation at all. She thought it was a series of events that she couldn't explain. Throwing her cigarette on the ground, she put out the butt with her foot and said that she would go on reconnaissance. She looked at her friend and said that while she was gone, he should look after this guy. Her friend was a little upset. He didn't want her to leave him alone with Frankie, Four Fingers, that's what he nicknamed him. The girl told her friend that he should hear this snoring that was now coming from this guy's room. He was rattling like a straight opposite current, and she very much doubted that this guy would wake up before she returned. Her friend, who had not finished his cup of coffee, put it next to him and agreed with her. The only thing he told her was that she should be careful. He also reminded her once to remember to put on her fucking helmet because she had to hide her face. The girl dismissively said that she knew everything perfectly well, and there was no need to remind her. Move away a little. She raised her hand and said that she would be back very soon. Her friend remained sitting on the steps near the entrance to this closed temple. He had no choice but to take a deep breath. He thought that he should probably go and check how this guy was doing. He headed through the entire hall of this temple to the stairs that led to the room where the guy was. Go to the door of the room where this guy was supposed to sleep. He first knocked and didn't hear an answer. He decided to open it and take a look. When he opened the door, he was very surprised because there was no one in the room. The bed where he was supposed to sleep was empty. Coming closer, He looked around again and saw that there was definitely no one on the bed. Looking around, he thought that he was definitely not in this room, and he felt a little uneasy. The girl decided that first she should drive up to the southern gate, which in her opinion should already be open. I drove up on a motorcycle. She stopped abruptly, but there was no one there except the birds. She got very angry and even started swearing because she didn't expect this. The sign again showed that the passage was closed, and the bridge that connected this island and the opposite side was raised, just like in the evening. The girl decided to go to where the workers were sitting, raising these bridges. She shouted to them from afar several times. Then she came closer and looked and asked again if there was anyone alive. But she didn't hear any answer. She decided to knock on the door. Maybe she thought someone would hear her. Despite all her actions, she did not hear a single answer. She saw that there was no one inside. Then she decided that she should try to open the door and get inside, but her efforts were useless. The door was locked. When she realized that the door was closed, the situation became even more suspicious to her. The girl decided to go around the house from all sides and she started screaming if there was anyone here. Well, I didn't hear any answer. She turned around and walked away. At that moment, she clearly understood that apparently there was no one here, so no one could lower the bridge. Looking around, she saw that in front of her there was a staircase that led down somewhere, and at the bottom of this staircase, there was an object that was incomprehensible to her. The girl didn't get confused. She decided that she definitely needed to go downstairs. Maybe she would understand what this object was. When she got down, she saw that it was an ordinary sneaker, but it was unclear how it got there. She immediately thought about the one she picked up and who is now with her friend, who can bring him these sneakers. She thought so only because it would be better for him to walk in someone else's sneakers than barefoot. She took this sneaker, turned it over, and looked at what size it was. It was quite a small size. But then, unexpectedly for herself, she thought, what if these sneakers that she just picked up didn't end up here by accident? After all, they should fit that guy in size. Has he really already managed to visit here, and what are those sneakers of his? Then it was completely unclear if these were really his sneakers. He just left them here. When she stood below and looked at the sneaker, she decided to turn her head to the side, and immediately after that she was in shock. What she saw could not help but horrify her. There was a bloody hand hanging and a large amount of blood around. The person had clearly been crushed. It was as if a flash went off in her head. She was already taking it in a completely different way. After a moment of shock and fear, she began to come to her senses. But her whole body began to shake and she staggered. In order not to fall, the girl put her hand back to grab the side of the pool that was hers for the day. She managed to grab hold of this restrictive side, and she stood like that for some time until she came to her senses. Turning to the other side, she looked closely at the place where everything was covered in blood. She couldn't understand what could have happened here and why a part of a human body was sticking out there. The first thing she thought was that it was most likely an accident, but if that was actually the case, then it must have been a very serious accident. She had no other thoughts. She could not give any other explanation. The only thing she realized for herself was that it was no longer safe to stay on the island. And what she needs to do is first of all lower this bridge. She turned away from this place so as not to look and began to climb up. Then she made a dash and started running. She had to do something, but she didn't understand what yet. Very quickly climbing up this ladder, she ran up to the very house where the workers who were raising this bridge were supposed to sit. When she ran up, she hit the glass door one more time, but the door didn't open. Then the first thing that came to her mind was to knock down this door. She unbuttoned her jacket. Then she wrapped her hand in it and hit the glass part of the door with her elbow with all her might. The glass broke and began to fall to the floor. All that was left was to open the door and go inside. The girl put her hand into the broken part of the door, turned the lock, it clicked, the door opened. When she went inside, she thought if she could lower the bridge, if she could do that, then they would cross to the other side. The only thing she wanted to do was to put this brain down as quickly as possible and then get off this island. When she turned on the computer to see how she could lower this bridge, she was very surprised. She thought that this is it. She got a system error on the monitor screen and needed to do something. Restart the computer again. She saw the message system error on the monitor again. The girl pulled herself together and said that she should calm down and concentrate. She just needed to lower the bridge now. For some reason, her hands were shaking. She looked at them and saw how they were shaking. She looked out the window and saw the same picture again, as a man crushed by this bridge hangs trapped. She closed her eyes tightly and began to tell herself that she needed to pull herself together. He was already a corpse anyway, and she couldn't do anything about it. She looked at the board and decided that she needed to lower the bridge. Of course, she was very sorry, but she had no choice. But the board again seemed to be a system error. The bridge did not lower. The girl understood that it would not be easy for her at all, but she needed to figure it out and let him down. After clicking again, she saw a warning on the computer that the computer could not access the external operating system. Also in this warning asked if she needed help or cancellation. She decided that she would use help. Hovering the mouse over the window, she clicked and her computer began to sync. She looked at the screen and pressed the help button a few more times, but for some reason the computer slowed down. Then one after another, error and error started popping up on her screen. The girl turned her head, looked around, pressed a few more times and got the same result. Error. After pressing the button again, the computer turned off completely. The girl slammed her fist on the table. She was very disappointed and upset that she couldn't do anything. She thought that it was all useless, that she could only make noise. She wanted to understand what she should do now. She turned her head to the side and saw the same sneaker that she had picked up down below. At that moment, nothing came to her mind. She just grabbed the sneaker in her hands. At this time, the guy woke up in the house and started going down the steps. It was still difficult for him to walk, so he held onto the wall with his hands. He felt that he was staggering. His legs were shaking from weakness, but he clearly understood that he wanted to drink very much. So he went down and opened the room where there was a tap with water. He was very thirsty. He went to the sink and lifted the faucet lever with his injured hand so that water flowed into the glass. The next moment he felt weakness in his hands. He could not hold the glass of water and it slipped out of his hand. The guy started to lose consciousness, so he slowly started to slide down to the floor, but he tried to hold on to the sink. When he was sitting on his knees near the sink at that moment, he had a clearing as if he had already been in such a situation. He remembered that someone's huge hand grabbed him by the hair from behind and held his head down. The guy tried to turn his head from one side to the other, but he realized that everything around him, the picture in front of his eyes, had become completely insensitive. He held his head near the sink. I don't understand anything that's happening to him. Gathering the strength he had, he tried to get up but was unable to do so. After this attempt, he fell on the rug that was lying on the floor with his head down, and he had no strength at all. He clearly remembered that moment as someone's huge hands held his head and pulled it down. This man held him and told him not to pull himself. He asked why he came back. His legs and arms were tied behind him with ropes, and his body was covered in blood. The man demanded that he give him an answer before he returned to take revenge. At that moment, another person came into the room where this guy was solving the problems and asked him if he knew who he was. The guy was just intrigued, writhing in pain. This man had a knife in his hands. He tested how sharp it was and told me to spell it out. The guy couldn't do anything at that moment. He didn't even scream. He just lay there silently. The man who was holding him was screaming loudly that he couldn't say that, and that most likely this girl had really spoiled him. Then they lifted his shirt and this man told him to listen carefully, that this word sounds exactly like who he is, and that he should not dare to develop. He took a sharp knife and began to cut out the first letter on his back. It was... The guy couldn't stand the pain and started screaming. It was unbearable. This man who was bullying him told him to listen. Otherwise, he wouldn't remember. He covered his mouth with his hand and said that the next letter is B, then I. Then he said the guy's eyes were in tears, but he didn't have the strength to even cry from this pain. Then this man cut the last letter on his back and said that it was the letter C and A. After which this man repeated the word killer several times. Everything around was covered in blood. And in front of this guy, there was another body that was covered in blood. This man was yelling at the guy that he was the real killer and was pushing him face down on the floor. He told him that he would never want to run away from this woman's house and pressed his face even harder to the floor so that he could barely breathe. The girl's friend who came into the room saw a guy in her, and he thought it was very strange. Come closer to the bed, he looked around. Indeed, there was no one in the room. He realized that he was not here. Well, then where is he? He didn't leave this house. Looking at the table, he saw that the glass that was standing on this table was missing. The young man went upstairs and decided to look around to see if he was somewhere in this building. Then he decided to go down where there was a sink with water. Maybe he decided to drink some water, the young man thought. When he opened the door, he was very surprised because he found it here on the floor. The young man thought that he hadn't heard at all when this guy managed to come down here from his room. The guy was lying on the rug. His things were all covered in blood. He didn't hear anyone. So the young man approached him and tried to bring him to his senses. He tugged him by the shoulders several times. When he saw that his t-shirt was covered in blood, he thought, God, how much blood seeped through the bandages that were on his back. The young man remembered that his girlfriend had not treated his back, but the patches that were on his back were clearly theirs. He touched the guy's forehead and realized that he also had a fever. Raising his head, he saw that the tap was open and water was flowing from it. The young man turned off the tap and wondered how long he had been lying there. unconscious. He turned his head and saw that this guy blinked one eye and he began to regain consciousness. Then he suddenly opened his eyes and began to look at the young man in fear. The next thing he did was to use both his feet to push the young man aside. The young man didn't understand what the hell it was and asked him what he was doing. The young man did not understand what was happening to this guy. He was very suspicious. This guy sat there with a pissed-off look on his face and told no one to touch him. The young man tried to pester him. He asked him for forgiveness and told him to listen to him. Because in reality, he is just bleeding, and right now it wouldn't hurt to change the bandage on his back and arms. The guy was very surprised that he had a patch on his back. He didn't even suspect it. So he moved further away and told the young man not to dare approach him. The young man told him well, and in fact he is not patient, so he will say directly, most likely he is delirious, and considering numerous injuries, he does not understand what is happening. Then he saw that this guy started to tremble, first just a little bit, and then more and more. In general, his affairs were pretty bad. The young man told him that if his wounds were not treated properly, he could get an infection if he didn't already have one. There was a few minutes of silence as the young man waited for this guy to let him treat his wounds or not. The young man decided to ask him again if he was deaf or just stupid if he didn't let him do anything. The guy sat like a beaten little child. He didn't say anything because he was afraid to answer. Then unexpectedly for the young man, he grabbed him by the sweater and started shouting that he was not stupid. His expression was no longer so childish. There was anger and fury in his eyes. He was shouting that he was not stupid. Immediately his expression changed and he was like a small pathetic child, but he continued to shout that he was not stupid. For some time he tried to say something about how he is not like they say about him, but there was no anger in his actions or eyes. Then this guy lowered his head and started crying really loudly. He became hysterical and cried loudly, wiping his tears with his hand. The young man told this guy to save his tears for the therapist, that he didn't need them at all right now. The young man kept telling him that he needed to treat the guy's wounds again. He took out a bottle and showed it to this guy. He said that he could read the ingredients if he didn't believe him. It was the same disinfectant that they used yesterday. He handed the bottle to the guy and told him to hold it with his nose because the guy Schmeiga couldn't calm down and was crying. He tried to read that this product is an alcohol-containing disinfectant, but he read it letter by letter. The guy said that he reads very poorly, so it is difficult for him to do this. The young man suddenly turned his head from these words and looked at this guy again. He was very surprised, because it was a bit strange that a guy of that age would behave like that, and he also practically couldn't read. But the young man did not focus on this. He said that he believed that each person has their own shortcomings. The guy wiped the tears from under his eyes and said he thought he knew what he meant. Then the young man wet a napkin and said that now they were going to change these ugly bandages before he started to feel nauseous or something worse. The guy turned his back to the young man. He was ready for him to disinfect the wounds on his back. At that moment, the guy thought that this was the girl who treated these wounds yesterday. She had already seen this. I didn't look at what she saw, what was written there. She continued to help him. The guy thought that in this case, nothing would be scary if this young man saw it too. So he took off his t-shirt and prepared for the young man to treat the wounds on his back. He tore off the bandage of the last letter A. There was a huge bottle of chamomile-scented detergent on the table. One guy was sitting tied to a chair near this table, and the other was washing his hair right under the tap in the sink. Then he leaned over under the tap and began to wash the foam off his head. After which he tried the hair on his head. He didn't really like it, and it seemed as dirty as it was. The guy said that he thinks it's just a regular cleaning product, and it doesn't clean his hair well enough. He looked at the hair and thought that maybe he should add some lemon to the mixture. Then he suddenly turned around and said that that was probably enough for today, and he would leave everything as is. He looked at the guy who was tied to the chair and told him that at least this detergent had figured out this guy before he died. The guy was wearing overalls. There was a badge on his pocket. Then this young man came up to him and took off the cap from the dead body. He thought that he no longer needed it. Then he put this cap on his head. He thought it suited him better. At that moment, he heard some strange sound that was coming from not far away. He turned his head. Beyond the threshold of this room, he saw another guy who was sitting on the floor. This one said, "Hello, Bo." That was the name of the guy in the cap. The guy who was sitting on the floor was called Elias. His hand was covered in strange red spots, the same as his face. Bo asked him if he was packing his things before leaving. He answered yes. They were going to the old harbor. Because once again he asked where they would move, really to the harbor. Elias answered him that yes. And then he added that they hoped to find a boat there to get from this bank to the other. Bo lifted the sleeves of his sweater. There were also strange red spots on his arm. He was glad that he needed to find a boat. Bo asked Elias if Leon was too optimistic, considering that this island was just a prison. And then he added that why give yourself extra hope because it's not at all easy to get off this island. Then Bo took Elias by the shoulder and said that he, however, gave him credit for trying to escape from this island. Elias answered him that it was not he who came up with the idea, that it was Amelia, and that he should thank her. Bo asked the young man why they hadn't told him about their plans. Elias was a little surprised by such a conversation and decided that he should listen to it until the end. Then he turned his head and saw that the guard was tied to a chair and he was clearly not breathing. This Lapin-type guard didn't look like a living person at all. Elias turned his head back and asked Bo what his plan was now after what he had done. Bo thought about it. He didn't know what to answer this guy right away, so he looked at him and smiled. And then he said that he was going to reunite with someone he hadn't seen for quite some time, and he was very worried. Elias told Bo that he can do as he pleases and he takes the towels and leaves as quickly as possible. After which Elias sat down near the washing machine, opened the door and climbed in to get some towels. At that moment, Bo told Elias to listen to him and turned and looked at him. Bo stood next to the guard and said, "Really?" And they won't even invite him to join their team because he thought that their idea with the boat wasn't so hopeless. Elias was a little tense. He didn't expect Bo to want to join them. They weren't counting on him at all. That's why the guy thought about it, because he couldn't make any decisions on his own. Bo laughed and asked what he was looking guilty about, but in reality he wasn't bothering anyone at all. Then Bo said that everything was absolutely fine after all, he was a lone wolf. After which Bo suddenly grabbed the man sitting on the floor by the t-shirt and pulled him. The guy asked him again why the hell he was doing this and asked him to let him go. Crazy psycho. Bo then hit the boy on the head with the washing machine door several times. He only managed to shout in surprise that no, he didn't understand what was happening and why he attacked him. Bo, fly stop, he dealt blow after blow. It brought him pleasure. The blows became stronger and stronger so that all the cleaning products that were on this washing machine fell off it. Then another blow followed, and it was so strong that it was not the last blow. Another blow followed, and it was after this blow that splashes of blood fell on the machine and on the wall next to it. Elias's head was already a complete mess. Blood was flowing around him onto the floor, and he was sitting on the floor and not moving. Bo took Elias's hand. He wanted to check his pulse to see if this guy was still alive. He couldn't understand whether he had finished him off or whether he was still alive, so he took him and pinched his arm. The next thing he did was he raised his hand closer to his mouth and bit it. The door of the washing machine was covered in blood. Bo held the guy's hand and tried to feel his pulse, but there was none. Then he said that Elias was not offended by him, but people also eat with their eyes. He widened his eye with 2 fingers. And then he added that food must be attractive to truly enjoy it. All his things were also covered in blood. He went into the hall with his 2 fingers, and from a pool of blood he drew 2 parallel stripes on the white floor. He said that he was quite the gourmet. Then he said that he can't even imagine how he has gotten slimmer with age. Bo looked at his hands on his knees and thought only that all this was just like the red wine that he lacked. At the same time, in the bathroom, a young man was tearing off a bandage that had been used to cover a wound on the guy's back. The guy groaned a little from the pain, but he tried to hold back his emotions. He squeezed the likes. After the first letter, which was Atla, he covered the next one with a plaster and saw the letters T's there. He responded one after another with a patch, and as he Atli, he read the word that was in front of him. The young man, when he read this word silently without saying a word, continued to treat the wound. The guy was very surprised why he didn't say anything, why he was silent. As he sat and waited for Christopher to treat his wound, he heard the door slam. The guy turned his head and saw no one. He continued to sit on his knees, waiting for his wound to be treated. The guy came up to the door and tried to open it, but he couldn't do it, so he asked if he had really closed it. Then he asked Christoph several more times why he did this. But on the other hand, the young man closed this door with a belt and tied a ladder to the handle. The young man stood and looked at the lock and how he closed the door. The guy who remained inside, closed, began to reassure himself that he needed to be calmer because these people were not dangerous at all. Then the guy walked away from the door and thought that the reaction of this young man was quite expected. He hides near the sink as he usually did as a child. He thought that his reaction was natural, but in reality they can't do anything to him. He hid as always in the bathroom and thought that these people who brought his ship would never harm him. If they wanted to do it, they had already done it. Christopher stood near this door and looked carefully. He waited for this guy to try to get out. At that moment he heard someone's footsteps. Then the young man turned his head and looked at the stairs that were next to him. He saw his girlfriend coming down. She had one sneaker in her hands. The young man asked her why she didn't tell him. The girl was a little surprised. She didn't understand what she hadn't said. The young man started screaming why she didn't tell him anything about the word killer carved into the back of this boy. Then he started shouting even louder and told her to wait, that he hadn't expressed himself that way, in fact, on the living thing carved on the back of this boy. The girl tried to explain something to him, but he didn't want to listen to her at all. He only shouted why she didn't tell him and that he needed a damn good excuse. The girl fell silent, and for some time she said nothing. She only listened to his scream. Then she said that at some point she decided that this whole story with his amnesia would give them a head start, and this guy would be calm and not dangerous for them. The young man kept shouting that it was fine, but why didn't she think it necessary to share her brilliant plan with him, not to mention that she dumped this guy on him? The girl smiled and told him to forgive her for this, but in fact she knew that he would refuse to help him, knowing the circumstances. The young man continued to shout that he would really refuse to help him because he was sane, and what she did was shameless on her part, since yesterday she had been acting extremely recklessly. He says that she herself did not accidentally injure her head somewhere because her actions were inadequate. The girl started making excuses. She said that she just thought that he was an innocent boy. The young man shouted that it was not his problem. The guy who was locked in the bathroom stood near the door and listened to everything they were talking about. The girl extended her hand and took the young man's hand. She told him that he was her dear brother and asked him to please not be nervous. Then she said that she admits that she acted stupidly and tactlessly, but asks to allow help to this boy. The young man, despite everything that had just happened and what he had told her, did not understand how she could ask him about this. The girl said that he allowed her to please let her do at least something good in this life. The guy approached the door at that moment. He wanted to intervene in their conversation so that they wouldn't quarrel. He knocked on the door several times and called for Christopher and Natalie. The guy said that he could hear their conversation perfectly well, but asked them to listen to him too. He said that he was not dangerous at all. He then added that he does not rule out the fact that he could be a target at any moment. That is why he understands perfectly well that perhaps by coming into this house with them, he is putting them in danger. The guy said that it is not in his nature to harm anyone, but the word that is written on his back. He fell silent for a while. Then he said that it was not written, it was cut with a knife. At that moment he remembered once again how it all happened. He remembered the pain he felt when they cut him alive with a knife, when they wrote the word murderer. Then he was silent for a while because he again experienced the same pain as then. The guy said what he thinks, and it will tell you more about his grievances against Ka and the people who attacked him than about him. The guy was saying that, as he said earlier, he is still here and they are still in danger, but in reality he doesn't want them to get hurt. So he asked them to please tell him where to go for help, and after that, he would leave them. The young man, when he heard everything that this guy was talking about, said that this was just a great idea. The girl said that she was afraid, but it was too late. Her face turned cold. The young man did not understand what she was talking about. Then the girl said that the operator who raised the bridges was dead, and in such a situation there was no one to lower the bridge. She said that the body of this operator was chewed alive by the bridge itself. When the boy and the young man heard about it, they were very surprised. The girl continued to say that the bridges were still raised, and she checked the other passages on the way back. They were empty, and the bridges also remained raised. She said that they are trapped and have no way out of this situation. The girl continued to say that it was 30 kilometers from the old pier to the mainland. There were no people here, and they would not be able to leave from here. The young man said that she was wrong, but there was one place. The girl asked him again. It seems he didn't mean that very place. The young man said that he meant this prison, and that it was the only way they could get off this island. The girl asked him if he was sure it was a good idea. At that moment, the young man knocked on the door and told the guy to listen carefully. The young man said that there are not many places to go on this island, but there is a prison where they can help him. They even have a map. The guy said that it was great, and he asked to give him a card, and he would leave right now. The girl stopped the young man and told him to keep quiet for a second. She was sure it wasn't a good idea. They might as well call the cops themselves. Then she very quietly approached her friend's ear and began to say that if this guy told where he was, and what if he tells about them, and they find out who they really are and their real names? The young man told her that she should understand that as soon as they take him to the hospital, the police will immediately have to show up at the court, and one way or another, they will interrogate them. The young man thought that this guy was involved in something very serious. They wouldn't just patch him up and send him home. The girl agreed with her friend. He said that he was really right and she understands it. The young man said that this is why they won't take him to prison. The girl was a little surprised by what he meant. The young man said that they would only convince him that he would go to prison. Then he added that he really just wants to get rid of him and nothing more. The girl said that he must have gone crazy. You can't act like that when you're a wounded person. The young man started to object to her. He said that this was the only way they could leave the island unnoticed. The girl said that you don't make any sense there. The young man said that only this guy knows that they are here, so they will help him, and he naturally will not forget to mention them. And as soon as he tells them everything, what will happen if they dig up dirt on them and investigate this case? The young man was saying that they could avoid all of this by simply getting rid of this guy. In fact, they didn't flee to this country to end up in even more shit. The girl didn't understand how she could end up in even more shit. That's what he was afraid of if he killed this boy. The young man did not understand why she was so fixated on the role of benefactor that she stopped thinking sensibly. He didn't understand what had come over her lately. Before, she had never doubted what they were doing. Then the young man looked at her and asked where she got that sneaker that she was constantly twirling in her hands. The girl said that she found him near the corpse. It looks like the sneaker she is holding belongs to this guy. The young man began to untie the door and asked the girl if she still considered this guy innocent, as he was very suspicious to him. The young man added that if he is not mistaken, her sympathy blinds her and she does not see the obvious. At that moment, the young man opened the door to the bathroom and told the guy that it was time for him to leave. This guy walked away from them and said that he heard absolutely everything that they were whispering about and asked why they were acting so suspiciously. The young man answered him that it was obvious because this guy was suspicious to them. He lowered his eyes and saw the sneaker in her hands. The same guy said that it was his sneaker. The girl asked him if it was serious and he recognized it. The young man said that it was even more suspicious. The guy said when he took this sneaker in his hands that it was very similar to his sneaker. The girl touched the forehead of his head. She was very hot. The girl said he had a fever. The guy said everything was fine, and the sooner he got to prison, the better it would be for him. The girl unexpectedly smiled and said if he wants it, then so be it. Then she added, if he wants to leave so badly, he's probably a good guy, to which he replied that he already said that he's not dangerous at all. The young man took him by the shoulder and said that going with such a haram alone was not the best idea. Then he grabbed the guy by the hands and said that he was ready to take him. The guy screamed because he was in pain, and at that moment he dropped his sneaker. The guy said that if they just give him a map, he can get there himself. To which the young man said that with such a thing it is haram. God forbid he falls down somewhere on the road. The guy told him that he shouldn't worry about it, but that the young man told him that the sooner they get to prison, the better for him. The guy tried to stay in any way he could. He started shouting that he knew about all this, but what about disinfection? The young man said that they would help him with this too. The guy told the young man to let him go. He didn't understand what kind of iron grip he had. He felt uncomfortable. The young man pulled him up the stairs and told him to watch his feet. The guy told him that he could walk just fine on his own. The girl followed them, and when she caught up, she told the young man to stop. The girl said that this guy definitely doesn't feel very comfortable being in his company. The young man replied that he doesn't care. The guy said that he thanks them. The girl said that everything was fine and she could help. She would take him to prison. The young man said that in that case they could go together, or rather they should go together. The girl categorically said no, she brought this guy here, so she herself takes responsibility for taking him to prison. She said that she was ready to do it. She was completely sure of it. Her friend said he didn't think it was a good idea, and he completely disagreed with her. Their conversation was interrupted by a guy. He said that it was already starting to irritate him. He had already told them both that he could get there alone. And then he added that he was ready to go there himself than with this young man. He didn't trust him because he had just recently locked him in the bathroom. He of course understood perfectly well why he did it and appreciated the help he had given, but he would never again allow anyone to treat him as rudely as they had before. The young man put both his hands on the girl's shoulders and looked straight into her eyes. Then he started hugging her and saying that it was just a hug. When he hugged her, he quietly told her in her ear that this guy doesn't trust him at all, so she has to do what she has to do. Then the young man said that he agreed, which meant that Natalie had to accompany him to prison. The girl turned around, looked at the guy, and asked if he was ready to go with her. He was already dressed in his clothes and was holding a glass of water in his hands. He had a slipper on one foot and his sneaker on the other. He said that he was ready and thanked them for feeding him. The girl asked how he was feeling. He said that he had taken some more ibuprofen, or that the fever had almost gone down, and thanks to the new patches, his back hurt less. The girl said that it was wonderful. The young man asked Natalie to come to him. He had to give her something before she left. The young man bent down, lifted the seats, and began to look for something. The young man gave the girl a gun and told her to hold it just in case. The girl took this gun. She didn't want to use it under any circumstances. When the guy saw this gun, he was still upset. He understood that something was wrong here. The guy asked Christar if he really kept this gun under the bench, and the young man simply answered him that it was the church and that he could have hidden it somewhere else. Then the young man said that if he remembers that Natalie found a dead man, then there could be a killer outside. The guy was very upset. He even turned a little pale. He said that he understood everything perfectly well. He looked at his reflection in a glass of water. In fact, there is a killer out there somewhere. And just from this thought, he stopped in his tracks very terribly. He suddenly felt unsafe around this couple, and now he couldn't do anything about it. When they approached the motorcycle, the girl put a helmet on the guy's head. The guy smiled at her and thanked her very much for helping him get there. The girl looked at him but didn't answer him. Then she told him to jump in as quickly as possible because they needed to go. The guy thought that these two did not give him a card, although they promised him the opposite. Unexpectedly for the guy, they stopped. The girl lowered her foot to the ground. The guy asked her why they stopped. The girl said that they were already close, but she was almost out of gas. The guy asked her again if she really had such a thing. She didn't have a spare canister. The girl replied that she didn't have any. Then the guy said that he understood everything and a walk wouldn't hurt him. Why did he say that this was a very familiar situation? The girl said that she thought so too, and if he wanted, she could take him by the hand. The guy looked at her, smiled, and said that he didn't need it this time. He thought that this time he could handle it on his own. The girl went forward and said that they needed to go down the hill. The guy looked down and saw nothing in front of him. It was pretty weird. When she had already gone down, he thought that on the road when they were driving to this place, he did not see a single sign, moreover. He clearly remembered that they were whispering something, but he couldn't hear what exactly they were talking about. He thought that all this seemed very suspicious to him. His hands began to shake again. At some point, he thought that if she had brought him to this place on purpose. The girl pointed to the side and said that the prison was right there. The guy walked very quietly and looked in the direction she was pointing. Where she showed, there really was a building that looked like a prison. He caught himself thinking that this really was a prison and she wasn't lying to him at all. He thought maybe he was being paranoid in the sense that she hadn't done anything wrong. On the contrary, she had only been helping him all this time. And she even protected him by keeping the wounds on his back a secret from her brother. He thought that everything she did for him was kind of strange. The girl stopped. He stopped too. He still didn't understand how to act. He didn't know whether he could trust her completely or whether he still needed to be careful. So he asked her to give him an answer to the question. Why didn't she tell her brother what was written on his back? She didn't say a word to Christopher. And he felt very strange. And he wanted to know the answer to why she tried to hide it even from him. The girl didn't say anything. She was silent, and this made him feel even more scared. He stopped trying to reach out to her, but it was too late. She turned around and reloaded the gun she was holding, pointing it at the guy. Now it was clear why they had gone down into this ravine. She was holding the guy at gunpoint. She took aim and held it on the mouse, ready to pull the trigger. The guy looked at her with a frightened look. He didn't understand why she was doing this. First she saved him, and now she was ready to kill him. They stood like that for a few seconds, but this time turned out to be infinitely long. Somewhere very close, they heard someone stomping, and this distracted the girl. She asked the guy at that moment. He heard it too. He didn't understand what she was even talking about. So he asked her again what exactly he was supposed to hear. She told him that she swears to God that she felt that they were not alone there at that moment. The guy said that he saw nothing and heard absolutely nothing. She turned around and said that it was very strange. The guy asked her again, and she replied that he needed it. Then the guy said that he asked her not to scare him like that again for a second, and it seemed to him that she was ready to shoot him. The girl turned her head first to one side and then to the other and told him to forgive her. And then she added that she wouldn't do anything to him, she promises. But at that moment, there was definitely someone there. They heard the sound of a motorcycle starting up. It was so loud that the guy covered his ears. The girl suddenly jumped up and ran up to the road. She realized that it was her motorcycle. As she ran up to the road, she heard someone trying to drive away on her motorcycle. She ran out onto the road trying to block his way so that he couldn't pass. But he suddenly started moving and drove ahead. She managed to shout after him that he was a freak and immediately returned the motorcycle to her. The girl was standing in the middle of the road. She was just in shock. She couldn't believe how it happened. She clenched her hands into fists in anger. She couldn't contain her anger and rage. After all, this motorcycle was her only way to feel free on this godforsaken island. She started screaming that this idiot would pay for what he did. She stood there loudly and swore for some time at this guy who stole her motorcycle. The guy took her hand and told her to calm down. He told her not to worry. There was a prison at the foot of the slope, and there should be police there, because he understood correctly. If that was the case, then he believed they would be able to write a statement about what happened. He started to pull her and say, besides, this is an island, and if they are already stuck here, then the thief is also stuck here. He walked down the slope holding her hand and saying that she would definitely get her motorcycle back. The girl said that it was good, and by the way asked him for forgiveness for scaring him. The guy told her to just be a little careful when she pointed a rifle. The girl said that in that case, he could support this rifle himself. The guy said that he didn't want to do that, because he didn't even know how to use it. The girl said that it was just nonsense. He just needed to pull the trigger and pull the trigger. The guy smiled and told her not to make him do it. He found it funny because he was missing one finger so he wouldn't be able to do it. The girl said that for sure, and she also asked him for forgiveness. The guy said that he appreciated that she tried to convince him that she would not harm him. But in reality, he thinks they will be safe if she keeps the rifle and they move on. The girl walked and thought about what to do in this situation because she couldn't screw up. On the other hand, she understood that he was very small and moreover, he was also wounded. She followed him and thought that this guy could be easily gotten rid of even without a rifle. She understood perfectly well that she could simply strangle him with her bare hands at any moment. But she squeezed his hand harder and thought that she didn't want to do this. From the very beginning when she saw him, all she wanted to do, it's only to help him because he was standing in the middle of the road absolutely defenseless. That's why she squeezed his hand even harder when they got very close to the prison. She couldn't let them get too close to that prison. She had to think of something. She only thought that if she showed up in this prison, her brother would be furious. She had only two options. She looked at the guy and thought that the first option was to kill him right now before they entered the territory of this prison. The second option was to leave him right there, but without her motorcycle, she wouldn't be able to go far. The guy asked what she was thinking about. Then he stopped and thought about it too. Something seemed very suspicious to him. He turned to the girl and said that something was wrong here, but he still didn't understand what exactly. When they came a little closer, they saw that Nazar's mesh fence was torn. He didn't understand why there was a hole there. Then they went to the point of the eastern observation tower, opened the door, and the door opened. The girl tried to knock and call someone who was at this point. But they didn't see anyone. They noticed that the things were all scattered. It seemed like someone had scattered them on purpose. The girl said, turning her head, and looked that there was most likely a raid here. She looked around and said that everything was scattered here and there was blood on the floor. The guy told her to look in his direction. The girl picked up Paul's metal pipe, which was covered in blood, and the blood continued to drip onto this pipe. They heard the familiar sound of her motorcycle, which meant the motorcycle was somewhere very close. The girl grabbed the guy by his sweatshirt and said that they needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. The sound of her motorcycle was getting closer and closer. She realized that they would not be able to escape anymore, so they better hide. On the street, the motorcycle actually drove up to the checkpoint of this prison. The girl and the guy hid behind things in the corner. They looked out to see what would happen next. They heard someone approaching the building they were in very quickly. They tried to sit very quietly, and the girl tried to see the man who stole her motorcycle and came to this place. The guy who entered the room had a tattoo on his arm. It symbolized a snake that was slightly wrapped around his arm. The girl pressed the guy's fist even harder. They had to make sure that they didn't give away that they were in this room. They sat very quietly, but in the guy's hands was that same iron pipe covered in blood. The girl told the guy that they needed to get out of here immediately. She listened, looked around, saw nothing, said once. At that moment, the guy with the tattoo abruptly pushed the things aside and discovered them. He didn't spend much time trying to figure it out. He said that he was ready to deal with them in a good way. But at that moment, the boy himself, without understanding it, hit the guy in the balls with all his might and told him to get away from them. Then they stood up suddenly and ran out of the room, while the guy with the tattoo was writhing in pain. When they ran out, they saw that the motorcycle was right in front of the entrance to this room. The girl was, of course, happy when she saw her motorcycle. At some point, they thought that they would be able to quickly leave here. But someone's hand stopped her. They held her by the shoulder. It was another red-haired prisoner. He demanded that the girl give him the rifle. She told him to go away. Then she stepped on his foot with all her might. And she hit him in the face with her head so that she hit him right in the nose. This prisoner hung his head for a while because she broke his nose. He started yelling at her that she was a little slut. The girl yelled at the boy to run after the motorcycle. But this redhead grabbed him by the hair from behind and tried to pull it. Because he abruptly pulled the guy's hair, he dropped the metal pipe that was in his hands. The red-haired criminal said that they just needed a rifle and that she should give it to them. The girl didn't lose her head, took the rifle in her hands and came closer to the red-haired man. She swung it and told him to hold on if he really needed that rifle. She gave him another blow right between the eyes, once again to carry over. The redhead let go of the guy's hair and he fell to the ground. He needed to run away as quickly as possible. The redhead told the girl that he swears to God that if she hits him again, he will kill her. He grabbed her by the rifle and told her to just give him the rifle, but she wasn't going to do it. At that moment, the guy who had the tattoo grabbed the boy and pulled him by the jacket. He said that he doesn't understand what these two are doing here on this island and what they are doing here. The boy was very scared and couldn't say a single word. The guy with the tattoo was shaking him down, demanding that he answer his question. The boy said that he didn't know, and tears started flowing from his eyes. He was very scared. The guy with the tattoo said that this is a closed island, and the bridges are raised here. He didn't understand how they ended up here. The boy extended his hand to him and said that he didn't know how he got there. At that moment, the guy with the tattoo grabbed his sore arm. The boy screamed very loudly because this guy was pressing right on his wound. The guy with the tattoo demanded from him how they could get off this island. The guy with the tattoo kept asking the boy how they ended up here. He needed to get off this island. He pressed so hard on his wounded arm that the entire bandage was already covered in blood, but he continued to press. The boy cried and screamed. It was very painful for him, and he didn't know what to answer. This guy crushed his hand so hard that blood started flowing from his wound, most likely because the stitches came apart. At that moment, the boy started talking about how he woke up in the car, and he doesn't understand how he ended up on this island. The guy with the tattoo told him to stop talking nonsense. The boy said it was true, and he wasn't lying. Then he started talking about how they stopped somewhere very close in some abandoned church. And then he, completely choking and screaming in pain, said that there was no way out of this island, and now he had to let it go. At that moment, the girl swung her leg and pushed the red-haired man away so that he would get off her. The next moment, she fired a shot. The sound of this shot echoed throughout the entire island. The boy stopped crying and looked away. He was very surprised. The guy with the tattoo was wincing in pain as he looked at him. The girl shot him right in the arm and blood sprayed out in all directions. She stood near the fence holding in her hands the same gun that she had. Then the girl reloaded the gun she had in her hands again. She was ready to make another shot. The guys who attacked them stopped. The guy with the tattoo started swearing really loudly because she shot him in the arm. He tried to step forward to take the gun from her. The girl told him to stop and not make any movements. If he moves even once more, she said she would shoot him in the knee too. From her expression, it was clear she wasn't going to joke. The redhead told his friend that they better step back, and they should just do as she says. The guy with the tattoo didn't understand how they could just take him down now. He was shot and was covered in blood. The red-haired man answered him that they had agreed to find a secluded place and wait for some time until all this was over. Then he added that he should calm down and not extend their term for even longer. The guy with the tattoo needed some time to calm down and figure out how to proceed. The girl held them at gunpoint and told them to get lost as quickly as possible. The wounded guy held his hand and swore, calling them just idiots. The girl and the guy calmed down a little when the two moved to a safe distance. But she did not take her gaze off the two of them who were moving away. She was ready to shoot them, but she was very surprised that these two also had no shoes. One was in socks and the other in slippers. The girl remembered that the guy who was with her was also without shoes. She turned her gaze to his feet and saw that one of his feet was in sneakers and the other in slippers. These two continued to walk away from them and were already at a safe distance. The boy asked the girl if she could really shoot that guy. He would be very upset. How could she do such a thing? The girl told him not to be too upset because those two had already gone far away. The girl came up to him, took him by the shoulder and began to lift him up. She said in a disgruntled voice that he had told these two guys about the church where they were hiding. She yelled at him about how he dared to tell the criminals where they lived. Was he really that stupid? The boy said that she forgave him. He actually wasn't going to tell them anything. Then he asked her again if they really lived in this church. The girl continued to yell at him and said that it was none of his business and that he didn't understand what he had actually done. She talked about how her brother was now in danger, and it was all because of him. She called him a dumbass a few more times and pointed her finger at his chest. The boy started crying again. He asked her for forgiveness because he didn't want anything like that at all. The girl said that they urgently needed to leave here and headed towards the motorcycle. The boy told her to wait because he was bleeding heavily from a wound on his arm. The girl walked up to her motorcycle, took out her helmet, took it in her hands, and was ready to put it on. She turned her head and told the guy not to make her repeat it twice. The boy turned around and looked at her and said that he was not going to go with her. She could move on her own. The girl asked him again what he had just said. Was he really going to dump her brother now? At that moment, he lowered his hand down and reached for that very metal pipe. He said that no, he is not going to abandon her at a time when her brother is in danger. But on the other hand, they can't defeat two adult criminals. He picked up this metal pipe and looked at it for a while, after which he said that he had to go inside because he had a plan. If he goes inside, he will find a phone, and with this phone he can ask for help. Then he will call the police to come to this island. This is their chance to contact and ask for help from professionals. The girl was very unhappy with what he was saying because she didn't want to get involved with the police at all. These two adults who escaped from prison were trying to find a safe place, and if there had been a phone here, they would most likely have immediately called 911. The boy looked at the girl and said, "Does she really believe them now?" The girl replied, "Of course not. She was just trying to get it across to him." The boy said that he does not trust absolutely anyone who tries to harm or kill him. He's just going to go inside and fix everything. He went inside right after these words. The girl was left standing on the street. She didn't understand what had happened to her and what to do next. But the only thing she understood was that she had screwed up. She had screwed up really badly. She held the helmet and squeezed it from both sides. She thought about what to do next. In the reflection of her helmet, you could see the boy enter the room and climb the stairs. He walked and looked at his hand after the guy with the tattoo squeezed it hard. The wound on his hand started bleeding. Blood dripped from it onto the floor. Despite the fact that his arm was injured, he still climbed up the stairs and held a metal pipe in his other hand. When he got up, there was a room in front of him. He opened the handle of this room with a metal pipe and pushed it so that the door opened. When the door opened, he saw that there was not a single person in the room. The only thing that was damaged was one window. He took a step forward and thought that thank God there was no one in this room, but he couldn't even imagine what he would see next. He turned his head to the side and saw a wall that was splattered with blood. Out of surprise and fear, he dropped the metal pipe on the floor and a loud ringing sound was heard. He saw that in front of him near the wall sat a man whose head was smashed. Everything around was covered in blood. This man was dead. This man had practically nothing left of his face. It was even unbearable to make out his features. Everything was covered in blood and was emerald. The guy was very scared, so he covered his mouth with his hand to keep from screaming. Then he closed his eyes and tried to cover his ears with his hands. He mentally told himself not to look. He was so upset that he couldn't even breathe normally. So he closed his eyes and started saying that he shouldn't look. He just needed to breathe. He took a deep breath and then exhaled. He took a few deep breaths and then exhaled, and he stopped being nervous and panicking. The guy thought that he had no choice but to do what he had planned, so he decided that he needed to take a few steps to the telephone and call the police. So he went up to the telephone and picked up the receiver. When he brought the phone to his ear, he did not hear the beeps. He saw that the wire was damaged. He held the damaged cord in his hand and thought about what to do next. He saw a broken window. The boy thought that apparently the people who did all this took it here and entered this office through this broken window. Coming closer to him, he saw that many sheets were tied together and were lowered to the very ground. The place where he was now was very high. The boy looked around and thought what else he could do. In front of him was the prison building itself. Without thinking twice, he decided that he needed to get inside this building. He thought that there were police officers there, or at least there was a telephone. He was only interested in one question. Is there a phone here at all? And can he call the police here? Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a notice hanging on the wall and decided he should take a closer look at it. When he approached these announcements, he saw a diagram of the prison building itself. But since he could not read well, he understood absolutely nothing. He raised his finger to the first inscription and began to try to read the word that was written there, letter by letter. First he read the letter P, then A, then R, but it was wrong. He made a second attempt and began to name the letters in the order in which they were written. The first letter P, the second letter R, the third letter A. He stood next to this diagram for some time and wanted to read at least one word of what was written there. He caught himself thinking that he did not remember one of the letters. At that moment, he realized that he was an idiot, and he was definitely stupid because he couldn't even read one word. Tears started flowing from his eyes. He was very scared and very upset that he couldn't do it. At that moment, he thought he was a fool. He remembered what the young man had told him about him being deaf or just stupid. And he also remembered that scary man who held him by the hair from behind, who screamed that he couldn't even say it, and that this girl had really spoiled him. He also remembered the words of the girl who shouted at him that he was really stupid, after which she poked him in the chest with her finger. Now he understood more than ever that he really was like that. This is the place where she poked into the chest. He began to rub with his hand. He was very offended and annoyed. He didn't want to feel like they thought he did, so he pulled himself together, stopped crying, raised his head, and looked forward. He immediately grabbed the sheet that was hanging in the broken window and pulled it towards himself. When he climbed out of that broken window, he said he could do it. He had to get them off that island. He wanted to prove to all of them who thought he was stupid that he was not like that at all, and that he was worth much more. The guy tried to slowly go down. When he did this, he calmed himself down and said that he had to do it. The girl stood at the entrance to the prison for a while. She rubbed her helmet. I don't understand what to do. The situation she found herself in was indeed not the best, but there had to be a way out of it. She looked again into the room that the boy had entered and then looked around. She thought that they couldn't defeat two adult criminals alone, so she put her helmet on the ground near the motorcycle. The girl did not understand why this boy immediately after these words went straight to such a suspicious place as prison. She was even more angry with him and considered him an even greater fool. The first thing she decided to do was to warn her brother that he might have guests. She sent him a message that there were foxes in the yard. This was her way of trying to warn him. Then the girl thought that nothing would happen to her brother because she had warned him, and these Zekovs no longer had a motorcycle, and they would not be able to get to him so quickly. Taking the first step towards the entrance to the prison, she thought. She was very scared. She looked beyond that fence and realized that she had been avoiding prison for many years now. At this moment, she is really going to voluntarily go into the walls of this prison. The guy, despite the fact that he had one very badly damaged arm, was descending from this room down a rope made from sheets. Having descended some distance, he felt the rope crack, and he grabbed it with all his might. He heard how it was torn because the shards of glass were rubbing against this rope. The guy thought that he needed to get down as quickly as possible. Otherwise, he could just fall to the ground. In just a few seconds, he was standing on the ground. He did it and was already down. Well, since he strained his hand so much, it began to bleed and hurt even more. He held his wounded hand so that to stop the bleeding, he thought about what he did. He could do it. The guy caught himself thinking that at some point, his sleeve began to bleed even more. When he stood below, he looked up and looked at the place from where he was able to descend. Drops of blood dripped onto his sneaker. He thought that his hands were completely numb because he was going down those stairs. He looked at the rope again and thought that of course he did it. But once again, he didn't want to go down because he might fall and hit his head. Of course, he understood that it was better for him not to do this again because he did not need another amnesia. He headed towards the prison building. When he approached the house, the building door was slightly open. He decided that he should go inside. After he entered, he closed the door behind him. He will do it automatically. He looked around and saw that there was a small box in front of him, and it had the letter A written on it. He went to the door that was in this box. Most likely it was the duty station. The door was closed, so the guy should have called, but no one answered. Then he opened the door himself and went inside the building. It was the duty station, but there was no one there either. He went to the table where the policeman was supposed to be sitting and saw that the computer was on, but no one was there. He decided that he should see if there was a phone there, and if there was one, then use it. When he climbed inside, he saw only a phone charger on the table, but the phone itself was missing. He jumped off the table and thought that if there was a charger, then the phone should be somewhere very close. Everything was scattered in this office. At the same time, the girl decided that she would still go after this guy, whom she called Frankie like Frankenstein. She hid her motorcycle and locked it so that no one could steal it this time. She took the helmet with her just so she could disguise herself so that no one could see her face. She put this helmet on her head. Her face really wasn't visible. She could easily enter the prison grounds. The girl, when she was walking, she thought that someday this boy would probably lead them to death. Frankie checked everything in this room, but he was convinced that there was no phone. Everything was useless. Probably the guy thought that someone took this phone with them. He left this office and thought that maybe there were some abrupt reasons for this. So he decided not to stop and began to move further along this corridor. He took a few steps forward and again saw blood splashes on the wall. He was very scared, but he decided to look in to understand what happened here. He again saw the body lying in a pool of blood. The boy began to tell himself that he shouldn't look at this. He should turn away and it would be better for him not to see this. He needed to somehow pass near this body, so he took one step at a time. He told himself not to look down, and he had to calmly walk around. He took another step. He reassured himself that he should be absolutely calm. When he walked around this body and took a few steps forward, he became even more scared, so he closed his eyes. There was another man sitting on a chair in front of him who didn't move. He understood that this was also a corpse, so he decided to close his eyes and just walk past. In the next room, it was apparently a laundry room because there was a machine there that was also covered in blood, and next to it there was a huge pool of blood. He needed to go further down the corridor. In front of him lay another body in a pool of its own blood. The boy looked around and saw another room. He decided that he should see what was there. When he approached this room, there were round stained glass windows in the doors, and you could see what was going on in this room. He rose up on his tiptoes to reach out and look into this round bend. It was a kitchen. There was a huge saucepan on the stove, and something was cooking in it. He decided to go inside. When he opened the door and went inside, he saw that there was no one there. He thought it was very surprising that there was no one alive in this room either, but there was still something cooking on the stove. This was very strange to him, so he decided to go up and see what they were preparing there. And most importantly, when he took this pan by the handles to see what was inside, he thought about who could be cooking it. When he reached this pan, he saw something very terrible, so unexpectedly for himself, he turned this pan over. The boy managed to jump to the side of the AK. The pan turned over, and all the contents spilled onto the floor. Then the pan fell, and besides the water, something else fell out, very scary. Because there was a lot of smoke and the pan was overturned, the alarm went off. The boy was very scared, so he took a few small steps back towards the exit. The smoke stopped more and more. The alarm did not turn off, but only made louder sounds. Imagine his surprise and fear when he saw that something was cooking inside this pot. At the end of this pot, a severed human hand fell out. It belonged to one of the prisoners. A few days earlier, on the very day it all began, he placed a camera next to a bloody saw blade. A man with a cross around his neck was dragging his father's dead body while a boy sat and watched it all. His father was lying in a pool of blood, and there was a huge hole in his chest from a live wound. This man pulled out a huge knife that was covered in blood. He held this knife right in front of him. Then the man brought the knife to the crying boy and told him to lick it immediately, and he slapped him on the cheek with the knife. This man was telling the boy that this knife looks quite appetizing, and frankly speaking, he agrees that his father is not at all his type. Then he stuck the knife into the dead body again and said that today his father could be their knife stand this evening. There was some rustling behind the door handle dropped, a click, and the door opened. The boy was sitting and crying. When the door opened, she entered the room with a bag hanging on her arm. She stood silently for a while at the entrance to the room, watching the knife stick out of the chest of the man lying on the floor. The boy brought her a little scared. He continued to cry loudly. He thought that she would calm him down. He went under and raised his head and addressed her. It was his mother. She didn't react to his words. She put her hand in her bag and started to take something out of it. She took out a fairly long rope from it and told the boy that he was an ordinary murderer. Then she said that his mommy wanted him to spell the word, namely the killer. The boy started talking about how he wouldn't do it. Then she said if he doesn't want to do it, then he should listen to what the rules are here. If he doesn't like it and he doesn't like her rules either, then he shouldn't have run away from that lady. Then she leaned closer to the boy and said that she was very interested in whether the lady really did hang herself. She sat opposite the boy and said that most likely he also killed her, and then started tracking her down. And then she added, no matter how you look at it, this family hides an incredible number of secrets. Most likely it is the number of secrets that no one knows that makes him afraid of the dark. And the boy, in accordance with this, is completely bound by these blood ties. At that moment, the boy got very angry and told her to speak for herself. He is not a murderer like her. His mother looked at him and said, does he really think that after all, he just killed his father? And then she added that she was absolutely sure that the woman was in the loop only because he left her alone. Tears were flowing from his eyes. He couldn't stop. He cried all the time. Then she added that he knew it very well. Then she said that he simply did not feel pleasure in committing all these crimes. The boy did not stop crying. She held the rope in her hands and pulled it tight. She said that he would know his place when they were done with him. He licked the floor all blood. It seemed that he no longer felt anything. He stopped crying. The only thing he saw before his eyes was the same camera that was constantly filming everything that happened to him. He was lying on his stomach, and the word killer was already carved into his back. A man with a cross around his neck sat on the table next to him, and it seemed like he didn't care at all. She shouted at this man, calling him Vincent, that she had enough. She was very tired, and he should do with him what he wanted. Then she left that room and told him that he got rid of the body as quickly as possible after he ended up with that guy. And she also added that she also needed to get rid of the man. There was not a drop of regret in her voice. Then she closed the door and left so as not to see what would happen next. She was no longer interested in it. Vincent told himself that she told him to get rid of the man, but at that moment she didn't even flinch when she saw that her husband was dead. He told the boy that he himself saw that she was a psychopath. Frankie lay there looking at his father's kneeling body. Vincent said his father thought the guy was some kind of vegetable. Then he added that he found him growing up, however. He always knew that the boy was smarter than he seemed, but he could not even imagine that he could fight back. Frankie asked this man why he was untying his video. He understood perfectly well that he was supposed to be killed. He heard everything. Vincent videoed him that obviously there is no fun without a fight, and he began to film him from all sides. I'm setting up the camera, he told the guy to lift it up. This is fine artwork and he can't make a mistake. He explained that he needed to catch a good shot. He needed something captivating to break through to the viewer. He explained that installing the lighting correctly to create an atmosphere and the composition requires a lot of effort. Then he pulled the boy's legs a little and said that posture is also important. Frankie was lying on a white sheet that was covered in blood. His hands were also covered in blood. He covered his face with his hands. When the boy was very scared or something unpleasant happened to him, he always put his thumb in his mouth and sucked it like a pacifier in childhood. At that moment, Vincent grabbed his hand and pulled out his finger, and the boy became even more frightened. The man started saying that this was a very indecent habit, and he would not tolerate it in his film, and he didn't care about his nervousness. He squeezed the boy's hand with all his might except for the thumb and ordered the boy to bite off his own finger. The boy clenched his teeth with all his might to keep them from sticking a finger in his mouth. He knew that Vincent wasn't going to joke at all. The boy got so angry that he started screaming that this man deserved the most terrible death. Vincent chuckled when he heard the guy's words and then told him that it was indeed so. Then the man pulled the boy's hand towards him, the card. The boy was very surprised and asked what he wanted to do. Then he screamed no, but it was too late because Vincent had his finger in his mouth and was clenching his teeth. The boy screamed, "Stop!" He screamed for him to stop and asked him to stop, but the man didn't even think about doing it. The boy was lying on the floor. He was screaming that it was very painful for him, with all the strength he had. Vincent bit his hand so much that it bled. He licked the blood and said it was delicious. Vincent laughed and said that he must have been a fool because it wasn't a finger at all. The boy begged him to stop because it wasn't funny at all. The man narrowed his eyes very slyly and asked again, "Is it really not funny as he says?" He looked to the side and said that he had a question. He clearly saw something. He told the boy to look in the direction where his father was lying, and there was a knife sticking out of his chest. He said that the knife was still in his chest. Vincent told the boy that he was already untied, and he did not understand what he was waiting for. Then he sighed and continued about how he had just killed his father in cold blood, and he didn't understand why he was doing this to him, why he wasn't resisting. The man asked the boy. It seems that the boy does not underestimate him at all, and this was very sad for him. After listening to the end, the boy kicked him with his foot so that he staggered and began to fall backwards. He wanted to reach for the knife that was sticking out of his father's chest so that he could defend himself. Vincent grabbed his stomach and started talking about how it really hurt. Then he giggled maliciously when I saw that the boy was reaching for the knife. He said that this was a completely different matter, and when he had very little time left, he would have grabbed this knife at any moment. He felt that someone was stopping him. He couldn't reach it. He wasn't allowed to do it. Vincent grabbed him by the hair and pressed his head to the floor, then lifted it up and hit the floor again so that the boy lost consciousness. Grab his hand, the very finger that he was constantly sucking, and squeezed it so hard that he couldn't even twitch. Then he stuck his hand, or more specifically that same finger, into his mouth. And then he ordered him to bite it off. He told the boy that he would regret not underestimating him. He ordered the boy to bite off his finger several times and he said, "Eat it." At that moment, he saw only the bloody mouth of Vincent, who ordered him to eat his own finger. Otherwise, he would do something to him that would make him dream of death. In the kitchen, you could hear Frankie screaming that he couldn't and crying again. There was a chair on the table. This was necessary in order to turn off the alarm that was screaming throughout the prison. The boy screamed for them to unhook him. The alarm was removed and the batteries were flying out of it. He sat with his eyes closed and screamed that he didn't want to, and when they stopped making fun of him, the girl took him by the hands. Then she took his fist with her hand and asked him to calm down. She began to stroke him. The girl said that everything is fine. There is no one here and no one will hurt him here, he cried incessantly. Then she took his hand, placed it on her chest, and told him to breathe the same way she did. The boy opened his eyes and began to take a deep breath and then exhale. I did this several times, and the girl said that he was doing everything right and that he was just great. Then he blinked several times, and only after that he opened his eyes. He began to understand what was happening to him and where he was. The girl lifted her helmet, looked at him, and said that thank God he came to his senses. If he really came to his senses, then he should show his 3 fingers. She was looking straight at him. The boy raised his hand and showed her 3 fingers. He understood everything clearly. Then she lowered her eyes. She understood that everything was over. Apparently he had another attack. Only at that moment the girl looked at the guy and realized that he was about to have another tantrum, and he was starting to cry again. He fell face down on her and started crying even louder. The girl hit him on the shoulder several times and then began to stroke his back, and she told him that everything was fine. She was curious if he remembered where they were now, so she asked him. Then she turned to him so that he could hear her. Because they needed to leave here right now. This place was not safe at all. She explained that because she was walking towards the howl of a fire siren, she was sure that soon more people would come to this place. As far as she could judge, they were not eager to deal with these prisoners. When she was saying all this, the boy was sitting next to her with his head down. She asked if he was listening to her or not. The next moment he raised his head. He had already stopped crying. He even smiled. He told her that he was very grateful that she came for him and did not leave him among all these corpses. He asked her for forgiveness and said that he thought he was doing everything right, but obviously he was wrong. The boy added that he would not do such stupid things again. The girl answered that it was not stupid at all. She considers him a kind and noble person. Therefore, she understands perfectly well that all he wanted was to help them. The guy said that he was very glad to see her. Girl, I told him that he was gone for only 20 minutes. The guy smiled and said that it seemed much longer to him. Then the girl patted him on the shoulder a few more times and said that she was very glad that he was okay, but that they had to go. He stood looking at her with his eyes open. He was very glad that he had a person who protects him and doesn't kill him. The girl said that they now need to leave here as quickly as possible. You can't be in the room. Most likely, some very serious massacre took place here. So they need to take something with them. Most likely they will have to defend themselves on the way out. The girl approached him and asked how he thought he could cope with it. Frankie suddenly looked at the object she found and asked what with the scissors. Of course, he was not entirely pleased to take this object in his hands, but he overcame himself and took it. He said if his life and hers depended on it, he would take these scissors and be able to handle them. The girl thanked him for getting ready and being able to help her if needed. She told him that they had to get out of this room as quickly as possible. Leave the room, don't go through part of the corridor and already approach the duty station. Having passed the duty part of this room, you did not look at the street pastor to us, but to enter quietly. When they approached the exit, the girl said that she didn't like this silence at all. She said that there was definitely someone here, but she didn't see a soul except him. It looked like a ghost town in the truest sense of the word. The guy lowered his head and looked at the girl. He was very surprised, and he was afraid for her, so he said that she had blood on her leg. The girl lifted her leg and said that she saw it was just an ordinary scratch. He asked again what happened. The girl raised her head up when they approached the tower and said that she fell. When she was going down, the guy asked her again if she had really fallen. The guy was very scared. He started screaming, "Oh my God," because the gun was with her the whole time and she could shoot herself at any moment. They approached the outer fence. The girl said that the fence had most likely been cut open with scissors. The guy continued asking her if she was okay. The girl turned around and told him not to worry anymore. She raised her finger up and said that someone had lowered this rope of this tower. And that meant only one thing. Someone had to find a way through the fences, she most likely said. They got out, then they wove a rope out of sheets, which they took from the duty officer's room, and allowed the others to get up. Climbing the tower was probably the safest way to get out of this place, but someone decided to take the more difficult route first. The guy asked how they managed to do it because the inner fence looks untouched. The girl put her foot on the hatch. She understood what was going on and how they were able to get out of this place. She said that most likely they went through the sewer. There is no other way out. The girl opened the sewer hatch very easily because the bolts were unscrewed. It was clear that they went through it. The guy looked and said that it was very narrow there. She added that most likely the channel deserves it. The girl said that it was obviously someone small, not an adult, unless he was very thin. The guy asked her if they were really going to go down there. The girl looked and said that she was going to go down there because it looked like there was another drain there with a net. First she went down, then after her the guy went down below, really glass dirty water. She saw the grate and said that they needed to move in that direction. Then they took a few more steps forward. The guy followed the girl. And after some time they were there was an exit above their heads. The girl said that he was the first guy who agreed. He tried to reach the first crossbar, but he couldn't do it because he was short. That's why she grabbed his body and lifted him up so he could grab onto it. The guy was holding onto the bar and he thanked her for helping him and lifting him up. The girl said that there are absolutely no problems, only he must act much faster. Because in reality, even though it is small, it is still heavy and it is hard for her. The guy tried to get out of this hatch as quickly as possible. They were free on the other side. He ran out. The girl climbed out after him. He shouted to her that she was right about everything and that she was very smart. The guy ran up to the last net that was cut. He thought it would be easy to get through it, but when he touched it, he realized it wasn't. He immediately jumped to the side because a current passed through his entire body and he seemed to go numb. Then the guy turned around and said that the grid was live so you can't touch it. The girl laughed and said, well, somehow she really is under stress. The guy told her to stop laughing. She looked at him and said that she wasn't laughing at all. to which he replied that he could see it in her eyes. The girl said that she had another idea and he should wait for her right here. She climbed back into the hatch and began to descend into it. The guy grabbed his head. He was scared to be alone, but he had no choice but to wait for her. He heard the voice of a girl who shouted at him to hold on and saw an object resembling a stick that was sticking out of this hatch. He was a little surprised because it was an ordinary stick. Why would he need it? The girl told him to look at what she was going to do now. She took this stick and went to the fence that was under voltage. Then she moved the fence with a stick on one side and then on the other side, making a hole through which one could crawl. When she did this, the guy asked her if she really didn't feel anything. The girl said, "No, wood doesn't conduct electricity like metal, so that's why she can't feel anything." I tried to explain to him that it was something like the transmission of electrical energy through an object is transmitted through iron but not through wood. The guy was the first to crawl through this hole. He was wondering why they were electrocuted when they cut the network, if metal can do something like that. The girl followed him. She answered him. Maybe he managed to cut off the electricity for a while. They were free. They were happy that they got out, and that's the only thing that's really important to them at the moment. The girl handed the guy her helmet. She asked him to support her and follow her. She hid her bike in the forest. When she got to the place where she hid her motorcycle, she was furious. She swore and screamed so much that the guy was even a little scared of her at that moment. The girl sat down on the ground and started covering her head with her hands because she thought those damn two had stolen her motorcycle again. Even though she locked her bike, it looks like they broke the lock and started it. At that moment, she was very scared. If this was really the case, then these guys couldn't have gone to church. If they are really on a motorcycle, then they could already be there in that church. The girl turned to the guy and told him he was ready for what they would have to do now. She said that her brother helped him. He let him into his house. She repeated this several times. He said in that case he is his debtor. They will have to run very fast now, so he should not fall behind under any circumstances. The guy answered her that he understood everything perfectly, and she could count on him. Then the girl put her hands on his shoulders and squeezed his shoulders. She tried to explain to him that this was very important, and that she was counting on him. She looked at him with a very strange look. It was a very unkind look. It was at that moment that she remembered what her brother had told her when they were breaking up, that she needed to get rid of him and this guy. After these thoughts, she exhaled and lowered her head down. The boy asked her what happened. Unexpectedly for him, she raised her head, looked him straight in the eyes, and said that she would not allow anyone to offend him. And then she added that no matter what happened at that moment, she looked straight into his eyes. She said that she would be ready to defend him, and at that moment she was very sincere. She took his hand as before and held it tightly, and they ran towards the church. The guy ran after her and thought how good and very kind she was. But in fact, if she only knew what he had done in this life, she probably would never have defended him. He became very curious if she would find out that he killed his own father. If she had known that his hands were completely covered in blood, she would have been able to say again what she had just said. He was already scared just from the thought of what he had done in this life, and he didn't want to think at that moment. The girl started to swear, who she started to choke, because they had been offending for a long time and quickly. The guy turned his head and asked her what happened. Why did she stop? The girl, catching her breath, said that now was a light break. At that moment, she thought why she was smoking. The guy then asked her how long they would continue to offend her. She said that somewhere around kilometers away, she was very exhausted. The guy answered her that he couldn't even imagine how far it was. He didn't know what 5 kilometers was. The girl said, then why did he ask? At that moment, when she was catching her breath, she looked at his legs and it occurred to her that she could ask. And she plucked up the courage to ask him about what happened when she found him on the road that first day they met. He wasn't wearing shoes, just like the prisoners they encountered and fought with. She was curious to know if he was one of those prisoners. The guy said he thought not because he didn't remember the prison at all. The girl was still standing there trying to catch her breath. She said that it was not bad in principle, but she still didn't understand why he didn't have shoes. She then added that even if he was one of those prisoners, he seemed like a really good guy to her, so she would still protect him. And even if he really had something, she wasn't going to judge him. The guy looked at her and said that this was the last time he would repeat that he was not a prisoner. The girl said that everything was clear to her, but she didn't understand what had caused those memories that he had in the kitchen. When she found him in the kitchen, he was going through some moment in his life and she clearly understood it. The guy answered her that this was not the place at all, and that it was not what she thought that served for his memories. It wasn't the prison that triggered those memories. The girl raised her head and looked at him. The guy thought about it and said that these were memories of what happened in the house and his parents. He turned around and looked at her and asked her to listen to him. He was ready to trust her. He started telling her that she had already helped him a lot. She had said that she considered him a kind and noble guy. And he thinks that she is also a good person. And that is why he is ready to tell her everything he remembers as soon as he returns to the church and make sure that Christopher is safe. He said that she deserves to know the whole truth that he knows, but hopes that she will understand that he remembers everything in pieces. The girl said that she will be very grateful to him. The phone in her pocket rang. She felt the vibration because it was on silent mode. And then she said that she wanted to go to the toilet, so he should wait for her in this place. The guy stayed sitting at the bus stop. He told her to give it quickly. He would wait for her right here. The girl said that she would be right there. She took a few steps into the forest and said that she would be back soon. She needed to answer a phone call. He was left alone sitting at the bus stop. There was not a soul around. He didn't want to be alone, so he wanted her to come back as soon as possible. The girl got to the forest very quickly and was glad that he finally responded to her message. She took her phone in her hands, turned it on, and started watching, but she was a little surprised. Some time ago, she wrote him a message that danger was somewhere nearby. But she received messages that her message could not be sent, and it was already the 6th attempt, she thought, because her phone has reception. Why is this happening? She immediately dialed his number and thought that he would pick up the phone. But instead of someone picking up the phone, she was told that the number she had dialed was temporarily unavailable or out of network coverage. She tried to dial his number several more times but heard the same thing. The number you dialed is temporarily unavailable. She was very upset. At the same time, the phone was lying on the table in the church. It was turned off because it was broken. Her brother stood by the window and thought that it was already dark. He was worried about her. He didn't understand where she was and why she still hadn't returned, because he had warned her so many times to put on a helmet. He hoped she was okay. At that moment, a motorcycle pulled up to the church, but it wasn't her. The guy was sitting at the bus stop, completely alone, and her helmet was lying on the bench next to him. It seemed to him that he had been sitting for a long time, so he began to look around. He raised his head and looked up. She wasn't there. He wondered if Natalie had deceived him or maybe something had happened to her. He heard some sound in the bushes not far from where he was. He turned his head. This noise was getting closer and closer to this. He turned his head from one side to the other. He got a little scared. Well, it was just a mother deer with a little fawn who were hiding in the bushes. They ran out, crossed the road, and ran on. He watched them play around and run across the road for a while until they disappeared. The guy sighed very loudly. He was already tired of sitting, but he didn't know what to do. At that moment, he again grabbed his head with his hands on both sides and a sharp pain pierced him. He didn't understand why his head was hurting so suddenly again. It had been happening quite often lately. He felt drops of blood falling on his knees, which made him feel even worse. He stood up and ran to the glass to see what had happened to him. When he approached, he saw his reflection and that the blood had drained from his body. He tried to stop the bleeding with his palm and threw his head back. Then he looked again at his reflection in the glass. He was very surprised. He asked the one he saw who he was because he didn't know him. In front of him stood a boy with huge green eyes. He looked a little like him, but it was definitely not him. The guy looked from the other side of the glass but saw nothing. Then it was completely unclear who this guy was that he had just seen. And how could he appear here for such a short time? He didn't understand what was happening. Then he looked at his reflection again and realized that he saw his reflection there. The guy thought that he must most likely be hallucinating again. And what he sees now in the reflection is just a hallucination. His nose just started bleeding, and the injection started again. And at that moment, he also had a very bad headache. It's most likely he's hallucinating. He doesn't know if it's true or not. That's how he began to reassure himself that these were ordinary hallucinations and nothing more. Well, the boy who was in his reflection didn't go anywhere. He continued to stand. When the guy asked who this boy was, he thought for a while and remembered what had happened in his life. The door to the room opened, and a woman came in and said that it was her so that he wouldn't be afraid. She said that they were alone now, and the guests had left early. The window of his room was boarded up. The woman told him that she had prepared everything in the kitchen and took him by the hand to take him to the kitchen. The woman said that his hair had grown very long and was already starting to bother him. She took him by the body, lifted him up, and said that she would help him now. After she helped him sit down on a very high table, she stood behind him. This woman told him to repeat after her. She touched his long hair. He was sitting in front of a huge mirror on a high chair, and she was telling him that he was 8 years old, and he had to repeat it. Then this woman said that his name was Uriah. He shouldn't forget that. She had a picture of this boy with huge green eyes on her mirror. This woman took scissors and wanted to cut his hair. He got a little scared. The boy said that he does not understand why he should call himself by this name because it is not his name and he is only 4 years old. If he speaks like that, no one will believe him. This woman said that he calmed down. It doesn't matter what other people think. She asked the boy because he will never leave this place and he will always stay with her. He should understand this already. Then the boy looked at her and asked why he couldn't leave that place. This woman took him by the shoulder and said that she loved him very much and they had already discussed all this more than once. She also added that his family hates him and his family doesn't need him at all. He turned his head to think about what she had just said. This woman said that his family are bad people and they don't want to have anything to do with him. If he leaves this house, then his family will harm him. She stroked his head and told him not to be upset. She loved him and would never hurt him. Then she took a strand of hair and started cutting it because his hair was really long. She asked him to tell her now what his name was and how old he was, as she had asked him to do. The boy slowly began to say what she wanted from him, namely that his name was Uriah. This woman continued to cut his hair. He had to repeat it to her more than once for it to be convincing. She cut his hair almost like the boy in the photo. He told her that he was already 8 years old, just like she asked. The woman said that he is a good boy and it is very important that he does not forget about it. And then she looked at him and said that now he should call her his mommy, and she was just happy. She asked him not to look at her so scared. She will always love him like Uriah. Then she said that she would take care of him until her heart stopped beating. That's what she was supposed to do as a mother. He didn't know how to react to this. He sat on this chair, held the duck in his hands and was silent. Then he squeezed the duck with his hands and called her mom for the first time. In response, he heard what she said. She called him her son. It was very sweet. When he woke up from these memories and lowered his head down, he saw that his hair was lying on the ground. Turning his head and looking at his hand, he saw that he had scissors in his hands. Most likely it was his name, and he cut off his hair. He looked at his reflection again and no longer saw the same boy. He saw himself, but with a completely different haircut. He didn't understand how it happened and how long he was in this state, but he understood that he couldn't be alone anymore. So he turned to the forest and called the girl very loudly. He didn't expect to hear an answer. After the first time he screamed, he stood silently waiting for her to answer him. At that time, the girl hid her phone in the pocket of her sweater. She understood that a lot of time had passed and she needed to go back. She thought that it seemed like she was risking much more than she could have imagined. She was very upset that she couldn't warn her brother. At that moment, she heard the guy's voice who told her that he had found her. The girl turned her head back. The guy at that time said that she forgave him, but she was gone for so long that he began to worry. She answered him that she did not want to make him worry. She asked the guy why he was hiding behind a tree. The guy was actually standing behind a tree with his hands over his eyes, and he told her that he couldn't watch because she said she wanted to go to the toilet. The girl said that she was done at that moment. He looked out from behind the tree. She said that they needed to go further. She took a few steps forward, stumbled and realized that something was wrong. She started screaming. The girl very quickly began to fall into some kind of hole. Most likely it was an animal trap. She fell face down into a huge hole and hit herself very hard. When she tried to get up, she felt pain and that she couldn't get up on her own. Then she pulled herself together and got up. The guy asked her when he ran up to this huge hole if she was okay. The girl replied that she was partly okay, but she was more scared. The guy looked at her. He was very worried. He was worried that nothing would happen to her. Her blouse was pulled up and he saw scratches and bruises. He asked her if she was hurt. Then the guy said that it seemed like her scratches were really swollen. Then he said that these scratches did not appear from this fall and she most likely hid them from him. The girl told him to listen to her carefully and not to misunderstand her. When they were in prison, he had a panic attack. She was very scared then, and she doesn't want to give him any more reasons for stress and worry. Besides, these are just scratches that don't compare to those cut out on his back. She began to tell that when she followed him, she first went up the stairs, then down the tide sheets to find him. First the towels tore and she fell. Then when she was already in the kitchen, he grabbed her leg very tightly. At that moment she fell. When she fell, because the rope broke, there was only 2 m height, and she only got a scratch when she found him. He was in terrible condition. When she fell to the ground, there were a lot of fragments from the broken window. All these scratches were because of these fragments. She found him. He was crying very loudly. In fact, she said this, but it was not the fragments that did it, but this guy who in an unconscious state first scratched his leg and then lived. He squatted and with all his might put his hand right on her stomach and pulled so hard that he scratched her with his nails. At that moment, she removed his hands, but he was not in a sane state. He most likely saw something at that moment. She did not tell him. She just took his hand and pinned him to the floor until he began to return to his normal state. She sat like that for some time. She saw how he, Kurchitsa, was crying in pain and saying something unintelligible. His face was completely ugly at that moment. Tears were rolling down his eyes, and it was obvious that he was in terrible pain. Then he started to speak in his own voice, asking someone to please stop. She understood that it was most likely his offender. He was in great pain. The guy extended his hand down for her to grab onto, and he helped her get out of the hole. The guy said that he was very sorry that she hadn't told him about all this earlier. He didn't want her to think that she was single. The guy said that he really wants to help her and not only get out of this hole. He wants to pull her out to see how serious her wounds are. The girl lifted her blouse again and showed a scratch on her stomach. She said that it was just a scratch, ordinary trifles, and a couple of bruises. The guy said that it looks like she's still in pain because you can see that they're swollen. The guy took her hand in his and he tried to pull it up from this hole. She said that it didn't hurt at all. It just burned a little. When she was already at the top, she sat down to catch her breath. It was a little difficult for her to climb up. When the girl came closer to the guy, she saw that his hair had become completely different. She asked what was on his head. Had he really decided to change his image? The guy said that he didn't like his haircut at all, the one he had before. The girl said that now he looks like a toilet brush with this haircut and added that in this case he would have to shave his head. At that moment he thought about this huge hole that the girl had fallen into. They both looked at her. I was dug up quite recently. The girl said that someone, it is not clear why, made this hole. Then the guy remembered something else. When he went down to find her, he stepped on a beer can with his foot. He turned to look at this can of beer. It was the same as the one that was in the car. It was very surprising. Was this hole really meant for him? Everything looked like this. He remembered when he woke up in that abandoned car, it was somewhere not far from this place. In front of this car, there was a prison fence. Inside, when he got stuck and started looking around despite the pain he was experiencing at that moment, looking down, he saw exactly the same beer cans that were in this car. They were lying all over the floor next to him on the seat and also on the front seat. This can that was lying here was exactly the same color and the same brand, which means the same person drank them. The girl also saw that there were beer cans around, but then when she looked around, she said that there were not only these cans here. She bent down and got up to the ground camera. It was the same camera that was filming the guy. At least it was very similar to that very camera. He had an internal fear that he would be able to see everything that happened to him. The guy got really scared and turned his head and told the girl that they needed to leave this place right now. She asked what was going on. The guy quickly started running away, telling her that she needed to leave this place. This Vincent could be anywhere. She didn't understand where he was running and who he was. When they ran, they saw many more of the same cans. The guy said, "If these beer cans are here, then they are very close to." He said that he knew where they needed to run and told her to follow him. The girl tried to clarify where they were running because the road was in the other direction. He ran very quickly and she ran after him step by step without asking unnecessary questions. The guy stopped. He seemed to hear strange sounds. The girl hit his back. The guy turned around and looked and said, "Here she is," pointing with his finger. He showed the car in which he woke up. The door was open. He said that this was the same car he was talking about. The girl said that he was serious, but he never told her about it. The guy said that they couldn't use the car to get to Christopher. He asked her if she could drive. The girl said, of course. When they got inside, the guy looked and said that they only had one problem, that they didn't have the keys. The girl told him that this problem will not stop them at all. She can start it without a key. The model of the car is very old. She thinks that it will not be difficult. She said she needed a screwdriver, and she thought it was in the trunk of the car. The guy said he didn't know, so they decided to check the trunk. She opened the trunk and was shocked by what she saw there. It seemed like there was nothing left to surprise her with, but it still wasn't over. The guy asked the girl what he should do if someone appeared who wanted to attack them. She came up to him, hit him on the shoulder, and didn't say anything to him. She was kind of weird. From her expression, it was clear that she had just seen something very scary and didn't want to talk at all. The girl asked this guy holding his jacket if he really woke up in this place. The guy answered her that yes. She jerked him and said that then she wants him to explain to her who it was in the trunk or for him to say who killed him. His father found him in the trunk of this car, all covered in blood. His eyes were still open. The guy was very upset because he knew who this man was and who killed him. He started to mumble something. Then he said that this man who is lying in this trunk is his dad. The guy started saying that his dad was going to repeat the same word "was going" several times. But he started crying loudly again and started saying that he had to defend himself. He spoke in fragments, but the girl understood everything he tried to explain, that all this did not stop Vincent. The girl said that she did not understand who Vincent was. The guy raised his head and began to explain to her that Vincent was his brother and that what was done to him was done by him. The guy pointed at the camera she was holding in her hands. He said it was his camera. Then she slammed the trunk door and then the door of this car. He was still kneeling on the ground and crying loudly. The girl approached him and demanded that he get up from his knees. She told him that she would not stay here for another minute, and he should do only what she tells him to do. They got inside the car. She asked him to give her scissors. She hoped that these scissors would work instead of a screwdriver. Then she opened the control panel and she had to connect some wires to get the car to start. The guy asked her what she was doing. She kept silent and twirled something. Then she took one part of the scissors and shoved it into the hole where the key was supposed to go. And after that, she turned these scissors instead of a key, and the car started. The guy was very surprised because the car actually started. He didn't know that you could do that. The girl was surprised because there was even gasoline. The guy was happy because they could now get to Christopher much faster than if they had run. He told her that it was very good, and they would cope completely. He extended his hand, trying to touch her shoulder. The girl didn't talk to him and didn't react in any way to him holding her hand. He simply begged her to look at him. He said that he was not guilty and shook her hand. Then he said that there was a recording with confirmation on this camera and she could watch it. He didn't care anymore. He cried again. Tears flowed from his eyes. He asked her for only one thing, that she would not leave him. At that moment, the girl said that he was absolutely right and they would really cope with all the troubles. The girl told him to buckle up because they were going to drive on a bumpy road now, and he kept crying. Tears were flowing from his eyes, and he had an expression on his face as if no one needed him in this world. The girl pulled the door from his side in order to slam it tightly, and it did not open. She turned on the headlights, and they started moving. She needed to get onto the highway where there was a normal road. The wheels creaked very loudly. It seemed that this car was so old that no one had ever driven it. But despite this, they were able to get onto a normal road, and within a few seconds they had already passed that very stop. At the same time, near the church where the girl's brother was, things were not so calm. Two prisoners who had escaped decided that they needed somewhere to spend the night. The young man heard the sounds coming from outside and looked out the window and thought that it was very suspicious. He had not expected anyone to visit for a long time. Two prisoners knocked down the lock with a huge brick and opened the door to this temple. The red-haired man told his friend that he thought the place was abandoned. The second one replied that he thought no one had come here for a long time. They decided to see if there were any clothes here and generally look around. When the young man saw what they were wearing, he realized that they were definitely prisoners. These guys said that they were very lucky, and first they found a motorcycle and now a church. One of them said that they were really lucky except for the fact that he got shot. His friend replied that he was just a whiner. The young man took out a huge axe and took it into his hands. He did not know how the meeting with the two prisoners could end. Absolutely all little children are waiting for the most important holiday every year, Christmas. Each of them prepares in their own way. They are taught at a young age to cut out beautiful snowflakes from ordinary paper. Bo was always a lone wolf, even when he went to kindergarten with the other kids. It couldn't be said that he was the shyest in the class. It's just that a lone wolf makes his own choice in favor of loneliness, so he was always alone. Even so, when all the other children were playing together, decorating the Christmas tree or decorating it with snowflakes that they made themselves, he was always on the sidelines. Even then, as a child, he understood that he did not want to be tamed when the teacher asked him to bring his snowflake. At that moment, he thought that he was protecting them all by being at a distance from them. But to tell the truth, he was rather protecting himself from this temptation. He did not give up the snowflake, but deliberately cut his finger with scissors until it bled. He was simply different. From an early age, he knew that he was a wolf who preferred human flesh. He cut his finger. He licked it because he loved blood. In his life, everything began with the most secret thoughts. These thoughts were hidden from everyone in his head when he sat and looked at the girls in front of him. He thought how good it would be if he killed them both with the scissors that were in his hands. In his head, at that moment, the fantasy had no consequences at all. He was holding the scissors. It seemed to him that they were absolutely covered in the blood of the two people he had killed. This was one of his most beautiful secrets that he discovered for himself at the age of 6. Everything that happened then on the secret playground was his own world, where he was the boss, where feelings of shame and guilt did not follow satisfaction. In his fantasies, he could cause pain, he could kill, and he did it over and over again. He didn't like what all the other kids were doing and how they were behaving. He believed that his fantasies were his freedom, but he still disguised himself perfectly. So he took the snowflake he had just cut out and gave it to his teacher. She said it was a very beautiful snowflake. The teacher said that she would hang it with the others, and she hung it in his fantasies. No one would point a finger at him and call him a psycho or a murderer. Even though they will spend all this time together, at the end of the day, they will never know the other side, and no one will actually get hurt. In any case, it all started out absolutely harmlessly for those around you, but the love of violence is like a drug. If you start very small, over time you get used to this dose and then increase it or move on to something heavier. When he grew up, he did not stop his fantasies. In his teenage years, the fantasies that he had in childhood were no longer enough for him. He switched to dubious magazines, and a little later moved on to animation. At first, 2D images were enough for him, but eventually they were replaced by 3D. Then he began to observe the actions of real people, and at that moment he realized what the problem was. The older he became, the less believable these videos were. When he was already 20, he watched snuff videos and watched red rooms, in other words, videos where real people died. At this point, he accepted the fact that he couldn't show empathy, but still, even with these videos, he couldn't remove his hunger. This nature is a downward spiral. It is an exciting and thrilling slide that leads him straight to. At that moment, he thought that he had reached the end of this hill, which meant he had reached hell itself. At some point, he found people who shared his fantasies. It was a whole community, and he united with a married couple. This married couple was also addicted, but what is most important is that they had the same thirst for finding a new thrill as he did. They spent a very long time living out their darkest fantasies in their basement. And then they became directors of snuff videos, they filmed them themselves and were actors themselves. He thought he could call it a mistake because he had broken through the wall between his imagination and the real worlds. He had let it slip through reality thanks to his insatiability. But he always loved it when he felt it flowing through his body. He loved the smell of blood. And despite the difficulties that arose along with this, such as getting rid of bodies or the fear of being caught, everything they did was not a mistake. Well, at some point, a boy who should never have appeared here got into this basement. He opened the door when another murder occurred. Not everyone was a little disappointed that he saw what they were doing in that basement. It was unclear how in this reality this child found them, because it couldn't have been a fantasy that created him. He came to his mother. His father pulled the curtain so he couldn't see anything, and started screaming for his wife to put him back in bed immediately. His mother pointed her finger up and said that he should still be sleeping. He should quickly go back to his bed. He tried to explain something to her. She said that there was no problem. He was an ordinary sheep in the middle of a wolf pack. As researched expect, they were nightmare parents, the boy cried and wanted to show her the bite on his face. His mom said if he didn't get back in bed within 5 seconds, she would spank him. They were just fucking wolves. Then in that room, something made him remember. He took the boy into his arms. He remembered the times when only he knew his dark secret. Even if it was always just a fantasy, he never had to share his prey. He carried it to bed. But when he united with them, every victim who fell into their clutches had to be shared. There were situations when they conflicted because each wanted to kill the prey in his own way, although in fact he was not against sharing. Until the moment when he met this child, because at that moment he wanted him. He wanted this child for himself. He didn't want to share it with any of them. He put a bandage on his cheek, but he knew it was much different. He always thought he couldn't show compassion to anyone. The boy turned his head and screamed that he did it, and pointed his finger at his brother who bit him. Somehow he felt very sorry for this child, or he was just a jealous wolf who was ready to protect his prey. He saw the boy's brother who was absolutely happy that he had bitten his brother's cheek. In fact, he was not very good at distinguishing these feelings that he had. All he wanted was to comfort and protect this child. And at that moment, he also thought that red suited him very well. He looked like a bullfinch. At that moment, he was really confused about his feelings. But he knew one thing for sure. He needed to get this child out of there before his own family turned against him. Because he was completely different from his entire family, and they felt it very well. Even his older brother felt it. He sensed it too, and he needed a plan to get him out of this family. He didn't even expect that a few days later, help decided to come and ring the doorbell. The boy opened the door before he asked who was there. He thought about what if an angel or a demon heard his call right in hell. There was a woman standing on the threshold. She greeted the boy and asked if she could talk to his parents. She had a church book in her hands, and there was a child next to her.